G'day mate, 40 here. I'm about to perform rituals of public humility, but please know that the reason I do all these live streams is because I believe that I have something valuable to say and that I'm deserving of a much bigger audience and that I have unique insight. But then, the more I learn about the world and the more I learn about myself, the more I realize that I'm a cliche. I'm a typical kid who comes out of foster care and is just incredibly thirsty for validation. And if not for my incredible thirst for validation, I probably wouldn't put as much time into my online live streaming and blogging. Right? The person without credentials and without success is likely going to be much thirstier for validation than the person with credentials and with success. And here's how I experience life. Right? I see the people around me and I think they're so much smarter, they're so much more successful than I am, and I don't want to be petty. Right? I really don't want to be petty. I don't want to be jealous. And yet, when I look back, I just see so much cliche and pettiness and jealousy in my life. I had a life-changing moment in something like May of 1999 after I'd been in psychotherapy for about a year, and I spent much of that year talking about my non-existent relationship with Dennis Prager. And I'd come into therapy that day talking about how mad I was at Dennis Prager. And my therapist said, "You're mad at Dennis Prager? You're mad?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm mad about this and I'm mad about that. And Dennis did me wrong here and Dennis did me wrong there." And finally she said, "You want to know what I think?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I think Dennis Prager had such a profound effect on your life that you blog about Dennis Prager to show him that you can affect his life." And I was like, whoa, I think you're right. And I never talked substantially about Dennis Prager again in psychotherapy. So I've devoted perhaps thousands of hours of my life blogging about Dennis Prager because he had such a profound effect on my life. And there's this like petty motivation that I have that I want to show him that I can affect his life. Now, I can recognize these petty motivations and then try to channel them towards the public good. And so if there's any value in my show, it's that I often recognize my petty and jealous motivations and then try to use them to do good. Many of my friends are considerably smarter than I am, right? Nathan Cofnas, I think he's got at least one standard deviation, if not two standard deviations of IQ on top of me. My father had a standard deviation IQ on top of me. In all the online IQ tests that I've taken, I've never scored above 125. And people like Nathan Cofnas are at genius levels of IQ. He got perfect verbal test scores in the GRE. And I think I scored on my SAT like in the top 92%, but nothing like what Nathan Cofnas has scored. And so I'm about to critique his latest essay, but what if I'm coming from a place of pettiness? What if I'm just jealous of what I see as his success and his brilliance? I use this stationary bike. That's how I get most of my exercise, and it's also how I get to watch live sports, and I get to watch my favorite TV shows and all that good stuff. And my stationary bike just finally broke down this past week. And so I bought a new one. But then when I was about to buy the bike recommended by Amazon for something like $130, right, Amazon said this bike takes about 2 hours to assemble. And I was like, heck no. I don't want to spend 2 hours assembling a bike. Let me see if this show is even transmitting.
11 o'clock this morning, the Bidens are live on The View here in Gotham City. There's a story in Politico today that says they've hired the former Pentagon spokesperson to manage the Biden comeback. I'm paraphrasing kind of, that Joe Biden wants to be out there. The 100 days is over. He wants to be prepared for the books that are coming out that will be critical of him. He wants to speak out against Donald Trump. He wants to defend his reputation. Politico is also reporting that the audio of the special counsel of his interview with Joe Biden that caused her to judge Biden an elderly man with a poor memory, that the Trump administration is going to release that audio, and that Biden's gearing up to fight back on all fronts. Now, you could say, as we've discussed, Biden's doing this to fight back, or Biden's doing this for his reputation. I talked to someone very familiar with the Bidens, And I think they've pointed out something that I'm going to say now that to me is the explanation, or at least part of the explanation, which is Biden Inc. has collapsed. All those Biden grandkids had a lavish lifestyle, which they very much liked. Hunter made hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. Joe, as a former president, is not in a position to get the same kind of paid speeches, corporate boards, book deal. Biden Inc. needs a source of revenue. And Hunter does, even though he was pardoned and he's not going to prison, Hunter does not have great earning capacity. And you look at the rest of the family.
Wait. The paintings aren't worth a lot?
No, the paintings are not worth a lot. So what I'm positing for you guys to weigh in on, Dan first, is my source right? Is what at least part of this is about is the reality that Biden Inc., the trough is empty. The spigot has shut down. They need a way to get back in the game to make big money to have the grandchildren fed and clothed and flown first class, etc.
It certainly could be. I think the challenge is at his age, kind of trying to start a new career, so to speak, a new set of endeavors is very hard.
Who else is going to do it though?
Well, no, I mean, that's the thing, right? His brother's been under FBI, watch now. You've got Hunter's issues. It very well could be. I just think the challenge for him is in all of these appearances, and I'll add Jill to this, we know what everyone wants to ask him about why he dropped out, about his age, and at least maybe we'll see today something different. He still doesn't have good answers. To be clear, the irony is I think he's going to set back the cause of Biden today. Well, that was going to be my next statement.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Kind of just go, yeah. So.
I agree. Sean, let me say it this way. Just imagine a normal family, a John Q. Public, the Public family, okay? The Public family at one point between the patriarch's son and the patriarch's brothers, they were pulling in $10 million a year, maybe more, right? What's Biden Inc. pulling in at today? I mean,
to quote the great LL Cool J, don't call it a comeback.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think he was ever. I don't think he was ever there. So they're not. I mean, but to your point, I don't know where the grift is over. Right, the big guy's not getting his cut anymore, and that's a problem. I get it. They've lived a very lavish lifestyle. The beach house. I got to imagine the property taxes.
So I want to believe that I can handle that. I am at ease with having friends like Nathan Cofnas who are much more intelligent than I am. But what if I'm just determined to blow up that friendship by making cruel and unfair criticisms because I just can't handle the IQ disparity? Right? I hope I'm not like that. Right? I want to believe that I am at ease with the brilliance and the success of my friends. But what if I'm fooling myself? What if I'm eaten up inside by petty jealousy? Right? I go through life feeling like most people that I know well are smarter and more successful than I am, and simultaneously I feel that I'm smarter than most people that I'm around. Right? I want to believe that I'm below average in envy. Right? I don't want to lash out from a place of pettiness. So please tell me that the following critique is not petty. All right. So when Nathan Cofnas, the philosopher at Cambridge University, tackles a topic, right, he usually does such a thorough job that honestly I have nothing to add. And so I almost never critique Nathan Cofnas. One, he's a friend, and two, I just have nothing to bring to the table. Right, this time, I think I have something to say. And if I have anything to say here, anything that's useful, in large part is because I'm stimulated by the excellence of Nathan Cofnas's argumentation. Just like the best tennis I've ever played was against tennis players far better than me. Now, I've never shown any athletic prowess in my life. Only on the rarest of occasions has a girl I liked watched me play a sport. And there was only one who ever stuck around for longer than 2 minutes to watch me play. And this was the woman who took my virginity, and she probably felt obliged to stick around for a boyfriend. So the painful truth is that I am thirstier for validation than is good for me. And I'm probably thirsty for validation due to my insecurity, due to my anxious attachment style, due to growing up in foster care, due to my lack of success and my lack of credentials, right? There are certain predictable weaknesses you see with the self-made man. And these weaknesses, I think, are readily apparent in my words, in my deeds, in my choices, in my life, right? So self-made man typically has overconfidence and ego. I can sound very sure of myself, pronouncing on all sorts of things that I know nothing about. And so when I have success, it breeds a belief in me about my own infallibility, which leads to risky decisions, dismissing the advice of others, and humiliating myself. So when I have any success whatsoever, I then overestimate my ability to handle unfamiliar domains. I have difficulty delegating. Whatever success I've had, I've usually built independently, so I struggle to trust other people with key responsibilities. That leads to me burning out or micromanaging. Right, with my limited formal education and systemic thinking, all right, I lack exposure to structured frameworks and academic rigor, so that hinders my strategic planning. I am highly prone to tunnel vision, right? I focus on immediate, tangible results. And this leads me to overlook long-term trends, ethical considerations, and broader social impact. Isolation or weak networks. All right, the happier, more socially successful I am, the less time I spend online. So self-made individuals tend to prioritize work and performance over relationships. This results in limited access to diverse perspectives and influential networks that might otherwise amplify their success. Right, the self-taught man often acquires knowledge and skills independently, often outside of formal education. And so without having passed through a structured curriculum, people like me tend to miss foundational concepts or advanced topics. So our expertise, to the extent we have any, is highly uneven, and we have many blind spots. If you're a self-made man, you've probably suffered from a lack of feedback or mentorship. You have, in all likelihood, inefficient learning paths. You probably spend excessive time on less relevant material. You struggle to prioritize what's most valuable. So your progress is slower than it would be if you'd gone through a guided education. You likely have difficulty with collaboration. You're accustomed to solitary learning, so you may struggle to work with others. Right, I used to have a whole bunch of guests on this show, and I don't have nearly as many high-quality guests on the show anymore. May well suffer from imposter syndrome. Right, I lack the formal qualifications and the track record of success, so I may be filled with self-doubt and undermine myself, lack of confidence, and because of my insecurity, I fail to take advantage of opportunities. Some typical weaknesses of the self-made man, such as myself: we are resistant to authority, we're resistant to structure, we put too much emphasis on independence. We tend to dismiss established systems, rules, hierarchies, expertise. We're highly likely to burn out. Our relentless drive and self-reliance can lead to overwork and neglecting personal health and relationships. We have a confirmation bias. We don't have diverse input into our life, so we cling to self-reinforcing beliefs and strategies. We miss alternative approaches. And so the quality that bugs me the most about people who do what I'm doing right now, sharing my views on life, the thing that bugs me the most about pundits and public intellectuals is with most of them, it seems like their every pronouncement is pushing for their own self-advancement. And I don't want to be like that. And so why do I hate this quality? Because looking back, I see it in my own words, my own deeds, my own life, and it embarrasses me. I once asked this woman, how would you compare me to my father? And she said, well, he's not as pompous. So like my father, I sound supremely confident on all sorts of things that I know nothing about. So I want to get real. I mean, I'm just a simple Jew from Kurambong. I come from the land of the uncircumcised. I am dust and ashes. Right? I want to perform humility here. I'm but a humble servant of the truth. If God wants to channel divine truth through my flawed vessel, who am I to say no? If God tells me to marry a hooker, as he instructed the prophet Hosea, who am I to say no? So, Lord, if it be thy will, please make me a doormat for other people to brush their shoes on. Make me that tiny speck of dirt that the universe revolves around. I don't mind. Let me just be a vessel. It's not about me. Glory be to God. Here I stand. I can do no other. So help me, God. The children are our future. I'm all out of love. And if you join my YouTube channel, you too can learn the lessons of the Holocaust, which just so happen to be the identical opinions about life that I would hold, even if there was never a Holocaust. Deflation. Name one price that has gone down. I think gasoline prices have gone down. I think the price of eggs have gone down. So here I stand. Right. Let's tackle Nathan Cofnas' latest essay on Substack. And here is the headline: Podcasts, bros, and brain rot. The only thing worse than an expert is a non-expert. So I'm skeptical of the significance of brain rot. I do believe that it is real. I just don't believe that it is as determinative and as influential and as devastating and as shattering to society as Nathan Cofnas seems to believe. So I generally believe that we seek out the type of intellectual stimulation that correlates with our IQ level, and I don't believe that idiotic entertainment will, for most people, most of the time, lead to any significant amount of brain rot. Okay, the only thing worse than an expert is a non-expert. Well, it depends. When it comes to your vital interests, the most skeptical among us, the most alternative among us, the biggest consumers of alternative media turn to expertise, right? If you have a serious health problem or someone you love has a serious health problem, you'll likely turn to the best doctors you can find. If your house has a serious engineering problem, you'll turn to the best home engineer that you can find. If the water quality in your house is seriously off, you'll turn to someone who has expertise. If you have a plumbing problem, you'll turn to a plumber with expertise. If your car isn't running right, you will turn to someone with expertise in your car. So the most skeptical of institutions still turn to expertise when it is with regard to your vital interest. When it regards to your survival and thriving, you will tend to not be gullible. Right, you will tend to be fairly hard-headed in your choices. For example, consider where you live. Right, you live, in all likelihood, in the best area congruent with your best interests. Even if you have an 80 IQ, right, you still want to live in the best location congruent with your interests. You don't need a high IQ to recognize that there are better places to live for you and worse places. So even the most expert cynical, even the most rejecting of expertise and the most consuming of alternative podcasts, you turn to expertise when it concerns your vital interests. Now, with regard to whether or not we landed on the moon, that has nothing to do with your vital interests. Your quality of life and your evolutionary fitness will not be significantly affected by what you believe about NASA.
Aren't cheap. They're used to a certain lifestyle, but not just them. To your point, the whole family was coming from one source, and they lost their USAID funding, basically.
Yeah.
So this is a problem. I get it, but to your point, I don't see where the new source is. No one wants to. Number one, no one wants to know what he thinks. Number two, he doesn't know what he thinks, and that's a bigger problem. When he goes on The View today, to your point, when I watched that BBC interview, he just set himself back. And
you don't think the Washington Speakers Bureau and CA looked at that and said, "Man, that guy needs to be flown all over the country and the world, giving $800,000 a pop speeches"? No,
I think they looked.
I can identify with Joe Biden because Joe Biden demonstrates the kind of self-delusion that has characterized much of my life. So I'm late doing this live stream because of technical difficulties. And why is it that I find technical difficulties so infuriating? Why is it that when I came to buy a stationary bike, and the bike that Amazon recommended to me, took 2 hours to assemble, why did I feel so much fury and helplessness? Because it magnifies stuff that's inside of me that's filled with self-doubt and self-loathing, and that feels that I'm simply not up to the challenges of life, and that I'm not a real man. And so I went and sought out the bike that was easiest to assemble. Right, I bought a bike that was purchased at about 1/1000th as often as Amazon's most recommended bike because it said it was easy to assemble. And then the whole time I'm assembling the bike, I am cursing and I am swearing and I am angry. It's 8 o'clock at night. I want to be slowing down and watching something soothing as I, move into going to bed about 10 p.m. And I'm just furious that I'm having to spend my time assembling the bike. And it took about 45 minutes, and it was easy peasy. But I'm just so furious that I have to spend my time. And I look back to this golden era when I think my last stationary bike, it came pre-assembled. And I'm just so mad. Why can't Amazon offer me a pre-assembled bike? Like, why does the greatest rider of my generation have to spend 45 minutes assembling a bike. It's like when I've had to move, right? It just brings up so much self-loathing and self-doubt when I see how I'm constrained in my choices of where I can live, and it just removes me out of the world of my delusion where I'm the greatest writer of my generation. And these technical difficulties that delayed this broadcast, they just magnify this self-loathing and this self-doubt and my fear about my lack of efficacy, that I'm not adequate to navigating life. And so I want to push those feelings away by trying to show you that I have some superior points to make than Nathan Cofnas. Here I stand. I can do no other.
Looked at him and said, hey, we're in the middle of a briefing right now. We're going to get back to you after the company retreat. Like
the family's income has taken not just a hit. It's gone from millions to I mean, I don't know what he's making now.
Now, Elliot Blatt says that fewer stimulants, right? Get off the ADHD medication. That will give you the patience necessary for these type of tasks. Well, no, I was even more furiously impatient prior to get on medication. Right? I am better able to grapple with life and assembling stationary bikes on medication than I was prior to medication. But when these struggles come up, such as the technical difficulties that delayed today's show or assembling my latest stationary bike, they are a mirror to my soul, right? They tell me where I'm at, right? There are some weaknesses in my soul right now. There are some flaws in my spiritual kit that I got so mad because there are other times when these things come up and I'm able to handle them. And the answer is not developing patience. You cannot develop patience. The answer is not developing my willpower, right? The answer is restoring myself to reality where I recognize that these tasks will take whatever time they will take. And if I'm at ease with reality, then I'm going to navigate reality more effectively. But I've gotten out of touch with reality and just been absolutely consumed by fury that all these mundane matters simply did not go my damn way. And now, to try to soothe myself, I'm going to try to show you that I am more right than Nathan Cofnas about free trade versus protectionism. But it's coming from such a petty place. But here I stand.
He got that one-page speech, but that's
gets what, $400,000 a year as a former president.
Right.
Yeah, but it's nothing like that. I mean,
that's a couple months of Burisma. That's nothing.
I get it. But and by the way, just to be clear,
Elliot Blatt says, bro, 10 deep breaths will relax you and allow you to be productive. Why do you resist such easy solutions? Because they're Band-Aids, bro. The problem is not the problem. The problem is a symptom of the problem. The problem is I'm out of touch with reality. I am denying reality. And I can put Band-Aids on that problem. But there is the problem. I am denying reality because reality is too painful, and I have slipped back into a world of delusion. And now I want to, from my place of delusion, try to convince you that I am smarter than Nathan Cofnas. Here we go. So Nathan writes, on April 17, researchers led by Niku Madhud-Sargon. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Right. One of the marks of intelligence is that people tend to pronounce more difficult words correctly. All right. So this guy, Niku, is at the University of Cambridge, and he announced that his team had detected dimethyl sulfide in the atmosphere of K2-18b, an exoplanet. I didn't even know what an exoplanet is, 120 light years from Earth. On our planet, dimethyl sulfide is only produced by living organisms. It is emitted in large quantities by certain species of algae, and it gives the ocean its special smell. So the presence of this chemical on K2-18b might be the strongest evidence ever recorded for alien life. Next paragraph. Candace Owens is one of the most popular podcasters in America. On April 17, she also had an announcement to make. She did her own research on astronomy, and she concluded that the moon landing was fake and gay. She told her millions of followers, you need to learn the history of NASA, of the Apollo programs, which were caught and they were satanic. They just wanted people to believe in scientific advancement. So I think Candace will tell you that science is fake and gay. Owens has come to similarly unorthodox conclusions on many topics, including World War II, the history of communism, and Jews in Israel. Now, Candace Owens should have free speech to express her opinions. At the same time, a healthy society needs mechanisms to ensure that people like her don't have an outsized cultural influence. So here's my first disagreement. I'm not so sure we need mechanisms to ensure that people like her don't have an outsized cultural influence. If you listen to Candace Owens as a method for optimizing for truth, you're a loser. If you listen to Joe Rogan on a regular basis as a method for optimizing for truth, you're a loser. If you listen to Ben Shapiro or Dennis Prager or Jordan Peterson to fill a hole in your soul, to make you feel better and to optimize for truth, there are significant ways that you are losing at life. There's something deeply broken about you. No one who is thriving in life and is seeking to optimize for truth turns to any of these people. Now, if you are looking for entertainment, or if you are looking for diversion and you're a midwit, then you may well experience your needs getting met from listening to Candace Owens or Joe Rogan or Brett Weinstein or Russell Brand. But if you believe that you are optimizing for truth and you are turning to Brett Weinstein, Eric Weinstein, Russell Brand, Joe Rogan, Candace Owens, all right, you're a loser. And your opinion doesn't really matter, right? There is a tiny number of people who decide what knowledge is. And it doesn't matter how many millions of people listen to Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, Russell Brand, right? They have no say about what knowledge is. It doesn't matter that there's a larger audience for these nonsensical shows than there is for the New York Times, right? They have absolutely no say in what knowledge is. And so it's not surprising that midwits choose midwit entertainment. So Nathan Cofnas says that this large audience for these low-quality shows might even swing elections. That's possible, but I'm skeptical. Joe Rogan and company's support for Donald Trump may have tipped the balance in his favor. I'm skeptical of that. There's not strong evidence for that. People who don't trust experts now look to podcasters and other alt-media figures, many of whom are comics, to decide what to believe about everything from World War II to vaccines to Ukraine to tariffs. Okay, there's a mistake here, and this is why I am smarter than Nathan Cofnas on this particular point. So I propose to you a point made beautifully by neuroscientist Hugo Mercier in his 2020 book, Not Born Yesterday, that we did not evolve to be gullible with regard to our survival and with regard to our vital interests. And what you believe about everything from World War II to vaccines, to Ukraine, to tariffs, doesn't have much effect on your vital interests and your survivability and your evolutionary fitness, right? If you get vaccinated, right, it will give you a bit of an advantage in not dying and not being hospitalized for COVID. But overall, the advantage is rather modest. So it doesn't matter what you believe about Ukraine or about the Middle East. Doesn't matter what you believe about abstract topics of economics, theology, politics, international relations with regard to your own well-being. So you can be the most gullible, idiotic person in the world and believe in all sorts of untrue conspiracy theories and still have a thriving life. You may be married, you may have kids, right? You may turn to conspiracy theories for entertainment and for feeling special. Right. Usually believing in conspiracy theories is a mark of a loser, but this loser behavior is a manifestation. It's not the cause of you losing at life. So Nathan says the result of this proliferation of nonsense podcasts has been a proliferation of ignorance with disastrous consequences for our culture and public policy. So I'm skeptical of that claim. So I want you to believe that I'm smarter than Nathan Cofnas here. All right. So I don't believe that these nonsensical pronouncements by Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, Russell Brand, Dave Smith, and company, right, are creating ignorance. I submit to you that they are exemplifying ignorance, that they are meeting entertainment needs and comfort needs. They are not taking people who are otherwise clear about life and well-informed and plunging them into the darkness of ignorance. And I don't believe that people believing inaccurate things about Ukraine or tariffs or World War II or vaccines has a disastrous consequence for our culture and public policy. So here's what I believe. This has always been like this, right? So knowledge, the winning narrative, is not decided by popularity. Millions of people can believe a false narrative, and they don't get to decide the winning narrative. Winning narratives are decided by power. So the first few weeks, Donald Trump was winning the narrative, but the last 2 months, he's been losing the narrative. Now, how could Donald Trump, the most powerful man in the world, be losing the narrative? Because the forces arrayed against him are stronger than Donald Trump. They have put together a critique that is more compelling than Donald Trump's critique, than Donald Trump's story, right? Donald Trump's message over the past 2 months has received universal contempt by the tiny number of elites who decide what is knowledge, right? There is a tiny number of people who decide what is knowledge with regard to tariffs, and they have universal contempt for Donald Trump's tariff policies. And Donald Trump's best and brightest, such as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and economist Stephen Moran, who's the head of Donald Trump's board of economic advisors, they've done at best an uneven job at making the case for Trump's tariffs to the elite. So on Liberation Day, Trump's tariffs received withering universal contempt from those who decide what is knowledge with regard to tariffs and free trade. Now, the tiny number of people who decide what is knowledge, they can be wrong. And sometimes our understanding of knowledge will shift by the funerals of those who decide what knowledge is, or by the creation of new elites who decide what knowledge is. And the elite reaction to Trump's tariffs today and over the past month is more nuanced than it was on the week following Liberation Day. So as a brilliant thinker named Luke Ford outlined 2 weeks ago, the elite conversation with regard to Trump's tariffs has changed over the past 2 months from tariffs bad to how to implement tariffs effectively. So we are wired by evolution to want the esteem of the herd, right? I want your esteem, but if I'm in a healthy place, I am less needy for your esteem than I am needy or desirous of my own esteem, right? I should want my own esteem more than I want your esteem. And either way, the esteem of the individual for himself and the esteem of the herd for the individual does not correlate 100% with excellence. So crap in entertainment and in news has always received a wider audience than quality thought. Right? People on average have average intelligence, and people with average intelligence rarely love quality cognitive productions such as this one. Right? The reason that I only have 10 live viewers on YouTube right now is because of the transcendent cognitive quality of this live stream. And I have to make peace with I'm speaking to an elite. So I've never heard of any quality thinker who descended into crap thinking because of listening to podcasts. Right? Brilliant people sometimes watch pornography, but they rarely change the character of their day job to match the pornography that they might watch, at night to help them go to sleep, according to a friend. Right? Brilliant people sometimes take drugs, but they rarely hang out with their drug dealer. Right? Brilliant people sometimes bang hookers, but they rarely introduce these hookers to their peers. Right? Brilliant people have guilty pleasures. right? But they rarely make these pleasures their primary pursuit in life. So usually idiocy attracts idiots and quality attracts quality. There are exceptions. As the great Talmudist Saul Lieberman said, Jewish mysticism is nonsense, but the study of nonsense is scholarship. So I ask you, has there ever been a time when low-brow culture attracted a smaller audience than highbrow culture? I'm not aware of that. Right? People who don't trust experts still choose experts when it is in their demonstrable, vital interests, such as when they have a pressing medical, legal, or accounting problem. Alt media consumers still want the best pilots, the best air traffic control system for the planes that they board. They want the best engineers for their buildings and their bridges and the high-rise buildings that they enter. Right? Now, you might argue people need the most expert theologians or the most expert of this or that because that is vital to their soul. But this is not a demonstrable argument in this fallen world. So when people of average IQ want information and entertainment, we should not be shocked when they go low in their choices. Right? More people will watch porn when they have that opportunity than read great books. People are hard to fool when it comes to their vital interests, such as where they live. So even those with an 80 IQ recognize the difference between a nice neighborhood and a dangerous one. On the other hand, there are not powerful incentives for people to think deeply about world events or about philosophy or about politics and economics and tariffs because they have next to no influence in these realms. Right? They have no incentive for thinking clearly and deeply about matters that are not vital to their survival. So I try to place commentators in their proper genre because once you do that, they really disappoint you. So it is an error to have the same expectations for Candace Owens as you do for that Cambridge astronomer Niku Madhusudan, or that you do for Joe Rogan or Brett Weinstein or Stephen Moran or Russell Brand. So I would call this a genre error to expect the same thing from these people, to judge them by the same standard. But would it be more accurately referred to as a category error? Right? Nobody tunes into Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, Russell Brand as an act of optimizing for truth unless you are a loser. Right? If you think that Joe Rogan and Candace Owens are great sources of truth, you're a loser. If you fall for some guru such as Dennis Prager, Jordan Peterson, Tony Robbins, it's because you are losing at some vital part of life that you feel this guru can fix. So we should not judge a game like cricket by the standards of basketball. Right? You should not judge a rabbinic sermon by the standard of stand-up quality. Right? You don't judge the quality of your tax return by the same standard you use to select a show on Netflix to help you fall asleep late at night. Ben Shapiro, right? He became successful by talking online at maximum speed or taking the most conservative positions possible, even if he didn't know what he was talking about. So it would be silly to judge Ben Shapiro and other talk show hosts by the same standards of academic rigor that we use to apply to that Cambridge astronomer. Right? Ben Shapiro has published many books, but he has published 0 works of scholarship. So don't judge him on scholarly standards. Right? Don't judge a pop song by the standards of great classical music. Right? A silly little love song has its own beauty within its own genre. It's not bad for being a silly little love song. Right? Think of this live stream as a silly little love song. A podcast for a mass audience with an average IQ of 100 is not bad for failing to be as sophisticated as a Nathan Cofnas interview of law professor Amy Wax. Right? Sometimes great thinkers give up on producing great work because they can no longer do it due to cognitive decline, or because the rewards of turning out nonsense rather than quality are irresistible. Right? Isaac Newton devoted much of his adult life to nonsense, such as the music of the spheres and religious speculation, because this nonsense gave him some kind of internal reward that is hard to fathom in a more secular age. Dennis Prager is brilliant, right? You can tell by how quick he is on his feet. Reaction times correlate with IQ. But he has chosen to use his brilliance much of the time to bamboozle people. Right? I am not as smart as Dennis Prager and Nathan Cofnas and almost anyone who's a pundit who makes his living from his punditry. But I sometimes have something useful to add due to a combination of some of my talents, some of my experiences, and the particular situation, right? I am like this bloke here, right? Who is this bloke? He is a bricklayer, right? And he is Trump's #1 fan in Greenland, right? Right? He's a bricklayer turned political player. His name's Jorgen Boesen. His idolization of all things Trump has won him friends in Washington and sometimes hostile attention at home. It has given him an unlikely new career, political influencer. So he may not have a genius-level IQ, but due to the particularities of life in 2025, he's become a political player. Every dog has his day. I may have my day. Now, generally, the smarter dogs have more days of power and influence and success than the dumber dogs. Right? The battle does not always go to the smartest and the swiftest and the strongest, but that's certainly the way that you want to bet.
They're also, someone brought up the library the other day on this platform. You have to decide every day what you're spending your time on. Are you trying to put the kids in private school, or are you worried about where the library is going? Because you can't ask for the same thing multiple times. There are probably some people.
And I'm sorry, and just on that point, I've always thought he was going to have trouble raising money for the library because he's not been someone who's not a good, never been a good fundraiser, and the donors are not currently in love with him. Right. So that's a whole separate money problem.
Right. But
for the Biden family.
When they give you your 3 things you're going to do today,
yeah,
you got to figure out number 1 is pay the bills.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to add though, because Mark, you said part of the the Politico story is about how.
Well, I've often had other priorities than paying the bill, such as self-aggrandizement or hiring a psychic to make my dreams come true. Don't recommend these strategies. They haven't worked out well for me.
He wants to take on Trump. He wants to at least be.
Right. I twice maxed out my credit cards to launch my online career.
Based on what he has said so far, he tried to, again, litigate the economy, that things were great, which is just not how people felt at all.
Right.
He doesn't have good answers, even on substance. Right. Again, I go back to when Trump came back. He talked about inflation. He talked about the images at the border, which were real, and then Afghanistan. He had 3 issues that were in his wheelhouse. Biden is just just sits there and pounds the table like things were good. I did well.
Look, right? It's in the spirit of bipartisanship, we got an hour and 45 minutes until the View starts.
Yeah,
so,
let's see
Mr. President, if you're listening, here's the thing: instead of relitigating the past, how about you make some productive suggestions to the future, like highlighting the young people in your party and saying that they've got the fight, the Frosts and the AOC. I mean, he needs to do something that people actually go, wow, that was actually a good idea. Right. Or you can't keep litigating how dumb the decisions were.
Closing this out, and again, if you have a question, please raise your hand if you're here on the platform. I want serious answers from both of you, not jokes, not hopeless.
Okay, Elliot Blatt says the capacity to be patient is a muscle that needs to be exercised regularly. Okay, I disagree. There is no point to exercising the muscle of patience. What you need is an internal, I need to stand this way with my left leg forward, because if I stand this way, there's this brown thing under my left eye. So, there's still a brown thing under my left eye. What are the women going to think when they see this brown thing under my left eye? That they're going to think that I'm not as virile, that I'm less of a man. Right, forget about women. Right, my worth is based on being a child of God. It's not based on women and their willingness to get naked. Right, Elliot Blatt says the capacity to be patient is a muscle that needs to be exercised regularly. I say to you, Mr. Blatt, that you, sir, are looking at the shadows dancing on the cave wall, and you are mistaking them for reality. What's really going on is that lack of patience is a symptom of being out of touch with reality and living in vagueness and delusion. And as soon as you realign yourself with reality, you will not have to exercise willpower. You will not have to exercise patience. You will simply accept that things take as long as they take. So it's much more important to not just do something, but sit there and have that internal rearrangement so that you're no longer relying on willpower and exercising patience, but you are in touch with reality. What about listening to Luke Ford on a regular basis as a way of optimizing for truth? Well, I propose to you that I am better on that score than most working pundits and talk show hosts and live streamers. Jews sure go after anyone who criticizes Jews. Yes. Every group goes after people who criticize them. But Jews don't go after people who criticize whites. Well, no group tends to go after people who criticize outgroups. Most people are primarily concerned with themselves and their own groups. So that tells me that Jews don't consider themselves white. And you would be wrong. 95% of American Jews consider themselves white. They overwhelmingly tend to live in white areas. And if they marry out of the tribe, they overwhelmingly marry white people. Criticizing the competition is different and easier than outperforming them. Is Cofnas joining the woke light now? Not at all. He has formidable things to say about the right-wing stupidity problem. You might be right about one topic, and Cofnas might be wrong about that topic, but that does not mean you are smarter or dumber than him. These are two different things, correct? All that matters is the algorithm when it comes to getting big on social media. You can get millions in a few months if YouTube pushes you. If you don't get the push, it is almost impossible. Well, thank you for that critique there, Dr. Friedman. Devastating, devastating critique. I'm going to have to take a few minutes to recover from the devastating quality of that critique.
If Joe Biden called you and you were inclined to help him and he said, Dan, Sean, I need to make more money for my family. I need to leverage the assets I have as a former president to get the spigot going because we need more money. What one piece of advice would you give him of how he can leverage the assets he has to do that? Dan.
I'd say, sir, what are you most passionate about? What is it that makes you want to get up and make?
He's most passionate about attacking Trump, but that's not going to make him any money.
Well, no, but I mean, if it's foreign, like let's pick a subject because you got to believe in it. You got to like.
All right, he said NATO. How's he going to make money off of being passionate about NATO?
So I would say then go start your post presidency focus is going to be on like world relations and Europe and taking on Russia. Then set up a concurrent business of companies that have an interest in that. And you can both kind of advise, consult like PE funds that want to understand all the different angles of that issue because it affects their business. And then also try to do good, right? You can do both.
Yeah.
Yes, you can do good and make good. Not so easy, but you can do it. Man, I've lost Michael. Where is Michael? And when you've lost Michael, you've lost America. And I've lost my place.
All right,
you only have a few years.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not sure that would gestate quickly enough for the grandkids. Sean, what would your advice be to buck rake?
I think there are two things. One, I mean, Dan's idea I get, which is maybe set up like the Biden Center where you pull in a lot of your former aides and let them do the work and you kind of grift off them. That's something that they could probably get behind. So it's you get all the Jake Sullivans or whatever. I mean, get a bunch of them, create.
So sometimes smart people who have a quality history of producing rigorous scholarship, sometimes they turn to hackery. Right, and academia has what's called the John U line, says statistician Andrew Gelman. Right, that is the point at which nothing you write gets taken seriously, and so you might as well become a hack because you have no scholarly reputation remaining. So John Yoo became a hack because he had nothing left to lose. By contrast, historian Neil Ferguson became a hack because he had so much to gain. Right, sometimes you can get fame and money by becoming a hack. So does the rise of the alt media reflect blind ignorance, right? In part, at times, but it also, this is Grok. Ask Grok about this. It says it sometimes reflects real failures by experts and institutions. When experts fail us, right, trust erodes. When institutions fail us, trust erodes. So perhaps the biggest dividing line between Donald Trump voters and those who voted against Donald Trump is in their trust of institutions. Donald Trump voters, by and large, don't feel that America's institutions are serving them well. So people often turn to plain talk because they are repelled by the elevated, highly critical, self-conscious, stylized, formal rhetoric of the elite. Right? People like plain talking, and Democrats are struggling right now because the way that elite Democrats speak rubs many Americans the wrong way. Right? There are many benefits to the highly critical discourse from the well-educated, but one of the downsides is that it doesn't feel real. Now, Nathan Cofnas refers to the disastrous consequences of the ignorance pushed by these low IQ podcasts. Well, it depends on the lens, says Grok. Misinformed trade views might lead to bad policy, but alt media can also amplify valid critiques. Right? Podcasters of the mid-wit IQ level might oversimplify. They might push conspiracies. They also can challenge mainstream narratives that gloss over important qualifications. So Cofnas sees the danger, not just ignorance, but the loss of a shared evidence-based framework. Well, as long as we have significantly different hero systems, what counts as evidence is going to differ, right? The perspective, the position of the observer is going to change what is seen as evidence. Right? Experts don't always earn trust, and comics often connect better to people's emotional needs. So I propose to you, nobody rots their brain listening to Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, and Russell Brand. Those who tune into these people have needs that are met by these midwits. Right, and Grok agrees. No clear data shows that podcasters swung 2024 for Trump. Though overall, the voters for Kamala Harris got more of their news from mainstream sources, and Trump voters got more of their news from alternative sources. Right, thoughtful people don't tend to regress into idiocy from listening to midwit podcasts. Nathan Cofnas might overreach by blaming podcasts for cultural collapse. People are not mindless drones, right? Those who are drawn to Joe Rogan or Candace Owens already distrust experts. This is a reflection, not a cause of their distrust of experts, right? Alt media fills a trust gap. It's not just a one-way ticket to ignorance. Thoughtful people don't swallow it whole, right? People are not as gullible as commonly assumed. So read Hugo Mercier's 2020 book, Not Born Yesterday, The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. Our cognitive mechanisms, like the rest of us, is shaped by evolution. We are naturally skeptical and discerning about the information we accept with regard to our vital survival interests. Right? If we were inherently gullible about matters crucial to our survival, if we were inherently gullible about identifying threats or choosing reliable allies, we would not be around today. We have evolved an open vigilance, a balance of cautious trust and critical evaluation, and that allows us to navigate social environments where deception is a risk. So here is Nathan Cofnas' thesis to his latest essay, and I disagree with both of his points. Nathan writes, blind obedience to credentialed authority associated with the left, or trust in a marketplace of ideas that rewards brain-rotting infotainment associated with the right are both failed strategies. So on the face of it, that is true, but on the face of it, this is not reflecting reality. Nobody serious argues for blind obedience to credentialed authority. The left-wing approach to credentials and expertise is more sophisticated than that. And nobody serious argues that high ratings and popularity equal winning in the marketplace of ideas. Right? What is knowledge is decided by a tiny number of people. It is not decided by popularity. So this strikes me as bizarre to argue that the marketplace of ideas is determined by the entertainment and emotional preferences of midwits. Right? The marketplace of ideas, as I have understood it, has never revolved around popularity and ratings. It revolves around the quality and the influence of your ideas and the adherence of these ideas among the tiny number of people who decide what is knowledge. Right? Neoconservatives, for example, have never been popular. They've never had an electorate, but at times they've been incredibly influential. So normal people don't care much about ideas. They don't have anything to contribute about ideas, and normal people cannot articulate a coherent worldview. Right? I spent about 8 hours over the past few days dissecting and analyzing this Nathan Cofnas essay. That is not normal behavior. So I asked Grok, what is the marketplace of ideas? And he says it's a metaphor describing an open environment where ideas compete freely for acceptance through debate, discussion, and scrutiny, but it's debate, discussion, and scrutiny among a tiny group of people. It assumes that the best ideas prevail through reason, evidence, and persuasion, much like products in a marketplace, but the marketplace is a tiny number of people who decide what knowledge is. Now, popularity can amplify an idea's reach, but other criteria will matter more for long-term success. Reason, evidence, logic, verifiable data, coherent arguments, the ability of an idea to have predictive and interpretive value will help the idea have more success, right? Scientific theories such as evolution have prevailed because of robust evidence and their explanatory value, right? The success of evolution does not depend upon popular approval, right? Ideas that survive rigorous debate and counter-argument are resilient. Academic peer review, despite flaws, is often valued because it sometimes tests ideas against criticism and critique. Ideas that evolve in response to new evidence and new contexts tend to outlast more rigid ideas. Ideas that align with prevailing values or address urgent social needs will gain momentum. Right? They're often more important criteria for the success of an idea than ratings and popularity. So, let's go to Sam Harris's critique of Joe Rogan. He says that when Joe Rogan brings someone on to talk about the Holocaust and how it's not what you think it was, or Winston Churchill was the bad guy in World War II, or he's got Dave Smith as an expert on Israel and Palestine and the history of that conflict. Dave Smith is a pure misinformation artist. Our society is as politically shattered as it is in part because of how Joe Rogan has interacted with information. It's avoidable. He could take responsibility that is his to take at this point to get his facts straight. I don't believe this is true. I don't believe this critique stands up. Joe Rogan did not shatter our society. Joe Rogan is a reflection of our shattered society. Dave Smith is primarily a critic. It's not surprising that he falls short as an intellectual. Like, where is the evidence that idiots talking to other idiots for an audience of idiots is shattering America? And guys, Grok says I'm right. My skepticism is warranted. Sam Harris's claim is sweeping and the causation is murky. If Joe Rogan's show was shattering America, we would expect clearer metrics. So, according to Grok, at least based on what I fed Grok, Sam Harris and Nathan Cofnas are overreaching here by pinning social fracture on podcasts like Joe Rogan without clear causation, right? We need evidence. So Nathan writes that Douglas Murray is the British face of conservatism incorporated. He went to Oxford, he writes books with footnotes, and he hangs out with academics. So I disagree that Douglas Murray is the British face of conservatism. He is the most right-wing public pundit who is treated with some respect in the mainstream media in England. I think that's where I'd go. I don't think he hangs out much with academics. I just can't imagine many academics being at ease hanging out with Douglas Murray, because there's absolutely nothing remotely academic in Douglas Murray's oeuvre, even though he has footnotes. Right, one of my books had footnotes. Right, my publisher, Prometheus Books, insisted on footnotes for my book on the history of sex in film, and I am not someone who is esteemed in academia. So Dennis Prager calls Douglas Murray his favorite English thinker, right? I close to 100% agree with Douglas Murray, and I close to 90% agree with Dennis Prager. But only a fool thinks of these guys as great thinkers. They're great talkers. Right? Douglas Murray's books are disorganized mess. They are the breathless recounting of one anecdote after another, and then sneering. So polemicists of a feather flock together, but a polemicist is not a scholar.
This consortium where you're guiding, that's number one. Number two, potentially start to talk to some of the grandkids about running for office in Delaware, because you probably have some good political capital there, but start to build the next generation of people that can say, hey, the Biden family's still in business. And then number three is, I think, start to create this elder statesman view of how do you do what you said you're going to do, pass the torch, highlight the next young people in the party, get seen as someone who doesn't litigate the past but looks towards the future. But I got to be honest with you, this is not an easy one. Yeah. Even if you want to be helpful to say, because part of what, as you know, you brought this up, the speeches and all this stuff, people pay. They don't want to, they're in a business. And if they can't make 15, 20% off a $100,000 speech, it's not worth their time for all of the logistics that go into it. So,
all right, back to Nathan Cofnas' essay. Nathan writes, there is a reason why people became tired of so-called experts. The expert class face-planted about 5 times in a row. Okay, we need precision here, Nathan. We need more examples. Where precisely did the expert class faceplant 5 times in a row? Which experts? Were they experts or were they quote-unquote experts? Right? An expert has valuable, provable expertise. A quote-unquote expert is just a claimed expert. Nathan says, Joe Rogan would not platform a rando with no serious training in martial arts to talk about MMA. Yes, that is a very good point. Someone passed himself off as an MMA commentator. His only credential was he'd watched some old kung fu movies. Joe Rogan would have no interest in hearing his opinion. Right. The podcast bros believe that they are in the position of some kind of, foolish kung fu master outsider. So Joe Rogan chooses guests for his show who are compelling to a midwit audience. Right? There is no magic formula for getting on Joe Rogan. All right? It's not easy to get on Joe Rogan. It's not easy to get that opportunity to perform for his vast but midwit audience. Right? It's not easy doing what Donald Trump does so well, and that is acting as the parole whisperer. Right? Donald Trump has an unmatched ability to speak to people with 90 IQs. Right? Usually it's very hard to speak to people who are more than 2 IQ deviations from you. So Nathan writes, at the height of our society's quote-unquote expert worship, credentialed technocrats taught us a bunch of self-serving lies, imprisoned people in their apartments for 2 years, and then said that anyone who questioned them was a racist conspiracy theorist. Right? So I find this critique a little over the top. Almost the entire academic and media establishment covered for them. Largely true. On top of that, we are told that people with PhDs in how smells are racist are also experts before whom we must genuflect. But the fact that some people with fancy credentials are corrupt, fallible, and frauds doesn't mean that their expertise doesn't mean that expertise in general isn't real. Some people have knowledge and training that make their opinion more credible and more worthy of attention than the opinion of a rando comic with a microphone. Right? So here I'm going to get precise. Like, who worships experts? Right? Nobody serious worships experts. People on the left, people in the establishment, tend to impart more value to credentials and to claimed expertise than people on the right, who tend to put more value on common sense. Neither perspective is inherently superior. Now, do experts with quotes around them, or plumbers or any other group, tell more lies than another group? Right? I don't think experts or experts with quotes tell more lies than any other groups. Most of us are self-interested, and we want as much status as possible. Did experts imprison people in their apartments? No, they didn't. Did politicians with widespread popular support enact lockdowns during COVID? Yes. And then those lockdowns were reduced and taken away as people got vaccinated. So I don't think Nathan would have written this sloppily for an academic publication. So America has never worshipped experts. Right? It's just a different level of credibility and esteem that the left and right use with regard to credentials and expertise. So as our society becomes more complicated, which it does every day, right, there are some people with demonstrable real-world expertise who have more power because non-experts can't understand what they're doing, but they still sense that they need them. So most of us want to live in safe buildings. We want safe food. We want safe transportation. We want clean air. We want clean water. And we recognize that there is valuable expertise in these fields that we are glad to follow. Overall, I would contend to you that our public health leaders and our politicians did a better than average job during COVID. They were right in their main points. Socially distance before you get the vaccine. Once the vaccine's available, take it as directed by doctors. Before you're vaccinated, or when you're stuck inside with people who may well have COVID or some other influenza, it's probably a good idea to wear a mask. Right? Nobody that I know of in the world, certainly not in America, was imprisoned inside their apartment for 2 years because of COVID. Now, in many of our biggest cities, public schools were shut for 2 years, and that is a shanda. That is a scandal. Once people were vaccinated, we should have reopened public schools. But you cannot have effective social distancing and leaving the schools open. So I think there was a very good case to be made that closing schools for the first year prior to the widespread availability of the vaccines, I accept that there's a good case to be made for that. I don't pretend to be an expert to weigh up all the variables and say, oh, it's definitive. Now, Australia was far more stringent with COVID lockdowns compared to the United States. And I think that may have played a part in 2020, Australia having about 1/40th the per capita death rate of America from COVID. But even in Australia, nobody was locked inside their apartment for 1 year, let alone 2. Nathan writes, consumers of alt media have largely given up on the notion of expertise. No, they've given up on expertise when it's discomforting. They do not give up on expertise when it is vital to their survival and their thriving. Right? When every credible economist on earth says that Trump's tariffs are going to be a disaster, they say, well, Nate Silver failed to predict the 2016 election, so maybe Oren Cass, a lawyer, or Batya Ungar-Sargon, a Marxist English major, and the ex-account cat turd are just as likely to be right about tariffs as people who know how to draw supply and demand curves, whatever those are. There is no practical incentive or reason why ordinary people should care about expertise in areas such as public policy and tariffs over which they have nearly no influence. Right? There's no pragmatic, vital, self-interested reason that ordinary people should pay any attention to economic policy or political policy or international relations because there's nearly nothing that they can do about it. And Grok says, no, not every credible economist labels Trump's tariffs a disaster, though a strong majority express serious concerns. Some economists see tariffs as a tool to negotiate freer trade. These views are outliers. Most data-driven analyses lean negative on Trump's tariffs. So I don't believe consumers of alt media have given up on expertise. They still seek out experts when their life and thriving is at stakes. Now, when it comes to podcasts for fun and comfort, right, people turn to different experts than the mainstream experts. Who do they turn to? Those who meet their needs for feeling right and superior. Right, what type of narrative wins? Right, a narrative that meets the needs of a particular audience. And that does not correlate 100% with truth. So if every credible economist said in 2016 that Trump's tariffs were going to be a disaster, how did that prediction turn out? Right, I do not remember a disaster. Trump had a fairly good economy prior to COVID. If every credible economist has said in 2025 that Trump's tariffs are going to be a disaster, how's that going? I do not currently see a disaster. As of May 9, May 10 now, May 11, 2025, there is no empirical evidence that Trump's tariff plans are a disaster. Currently, the stock market, for example, is higher than it was prior to Liberation Day. The only way to declare Trump's tariff plans a disaster is to speak from a position of faith unchained from reality. And we can say anything when we speak from a position of faith unchained from reality, and there's no point arguing matters of faith. I also contend to you that there are too many variables in foreign trade for any one academic discipline, even one as esteemed as economics, to be expert. Foreign trade, says Grok, is a beast with countless variables. No single discipline, including economics, can fully master. Economics has rigorous tools like trade models, but it leans on simplifying assumptions that miss real-world messiness. Other disciplines, such as political science, sociology, logistics, catch angles that economics misses. Even within economics, trade experts disagree because trade models cannot capture every variable. interdisciplinary approaches, blending economics with geopolitics or behavioral science, get closer to the truth, but all of them fall short of total expertise. So this complexity suggests humility is warranted. This is my argument. Right? Since Liberation Day, I've not been arguing that Trump's tariffs are good. I've not been arguing that Trump's tariffs are obviously idiotic. I've been arguing for humility, that it's a very complicated world, and I am reacting to the 100% elite consensus that it's just so obvious that Trump's tariffs are a disaster. Right? No one academic field owns trade. This is why people who set public policy lean on diverse advisors who aren't only economists.
It's not a simple proposition that he's asking for. I think the other thing is you got to start thinking about leveraging. Jill Biden still, I think, liked on the left by a lot of folks. Can she go out and do some stuff?
I don't know.
I don't know if she's ever made anything except her teacher salary. I have two things, and I did glance at the chat, and I've seen this in the chat, but I had them coming in. One is he'd have to write the mother of all tell-all books. He'd have to expose everything that Clinton's ever said to him, Obama ever said to him.
Oh, I'll tell you what. He
did.
If he went to grievances, if that was the book,
yeah.
Like if he wrote the book, that's what I'd give him a headline.
He'd need
Mr.
a
President,
ghostwriter.
write a book, call it Grievances. Tell everything about Pelosi.
No,
I'll buy it.
But he'd need a great ghostwriter. He'd need to make it like novelistic story of everything, and he'd need to burn every bridge. And number two, he needs to put together some sort of dog and pony show for speeches that people would pay for, and it can't be centered around him. So I don't know what it is, but he needs some sort of thing that people would want to hire beyond.
So take it from me, it's really worth it to burn bridges. And burning every bridge is almost always a terrible life strategy. I have burned way too many bridges in my life, and it's been incredibly painful. When I think about broken and lost friendships, just rips me open inside. And so many of my relationships are fractured because I'm an intellectual gigolo. I fall in love with every beautiful idea that comes along, but ultimately stay loyal to none. Let's look at the riveting chat on the platform X, because I am now speaking live on 6 different platforms. Live on YouTube, on Kick, on X, on Odyssey, on Rumble, and on Facebook. Kip says, famous orphans, Thomas Sowell, Steve Jobs, Alexander Hamilton, Tolstoy, Tolkien, Babe Ruth, Malcolm X. Kip confesses, I procrastinated for 10 days before changing out the battery in my car. Also procrastinated over a week before renewing my homeowner's insurance. I didn't want to face that 90-minute phone interrogation for a simple renewal. What if someone pleasures themselves viewing Candace Owens' content? Is that nefarious? It depends on what you would otherwise be doing with that time. It is more elevated to pleasure yourself to listening to Candace Owen than pleasuring yourself while watching pornography. Calling Hunter Biden a painter to funnel cash to the Biden machine was a clever move. Do you get bummed out every time Mother's Day rolls around 40? No, but I do get bummed out at times with regard to mothering when I'm not centered and not in a good spiritual place, not grounded in reality. The bloom is off the Douglas Murray Rose, Konstantin Kisin, Barry Weiss. One wonders if they are financed to spew ideological garbage aimed in particular directions. Well, the important thing is to recognize what other people do well. Douglas Murray is a fantastic pundit. He comes across in a way that meets the needs of millions of people. Barry Weiss is incredible at what she does. I think there is something like over 1 million subscriptions to the Free Press. That's incredible accomplishment. Intellectual labor almost never pays for itself. Right? You have to have patrons, or you have to have a day job, or you have to have some special hook. Education is largely a matter of being good at playing the game of education, right? Becoming an expert is largely a matter of having other experts vouch for you that you are an expert because you have followed the procedures and you have shown deference to those who claim to decide what knowledge is in a tiny arena, right? You have played within the lines and you have demonstrated that you are willing to be indoctrinated into a particular way of thinking. So one's IQ does not appreciably go up, right? Instead, fluid IQ starts steadily dropping after age 19.
Wonderful deal yesterday. We have 4 or 5
Beautiful
other deals
deal.
coming immediately. We have many deals coming down the line, and ultimately we're just signing the rest of them in. But we always have a baseline of 10%.
So, Batya, as we head into the weekend, just overall, where do you think it stands in terms of China and the other countries and the American economy?
I think he's in a really good position right now. I think if they didn't have this UK deal on the table, they would be going into the weekend with a lot less leverage. But basically what he did was...
So this is Mark Halperin's Friday afternoon show.
We had Liberation Day where he imposed these sort of massive tariffs and the stock market basically crashed. The global elites went absolutely wild. Wall Street went apoplectic.
So Batya Ungar-Sargon, I think, identifies as a Marxist. She has a PhD in English literature that I assume is from a Marxist perspective. And she also has interesting and useful things to say. And you win elections by expanding your coalition. I think it's great to bring into the Trump coalition people on the left, such as Batya Ungar-Sargon.
Apoplectic. And then he said, you know what, we'll just bring it down to 10%. And there was like this global sigh of relief at the idea of us generating billions and billions of revenue in tariffs. People were happy about that. And I urge everybody to go and watch the press conference. It got totally overshadowed by the Pope. But go watch the press conference in which the president announces the deal with the UK. Listen to Keir Starmer's voice as he sort of extols the brilliance of Donald Trump and talks so glowingly about a situation in which the UK now has a 10% tariff from the United States on it. Like, this is just art of the deal. And, first they said, this is going to be a tax on the American people. It'll never happen. They'll never get any deals. And then they started getting deals. And now, of course, they're saying, oh, this is not a good deal. We didn't need the deal. We had a surplus with the UK. Look at what's in the deal. This is a great deal for the United States. It's a great deal for so many of the sectors of our industry. And just like the fact that now these countries are like in this situation of gratitude to have deals that are so beneficial to the American people and the American worker, you just have to admire it. He really is pulling off things that I think if anyone was being honest, even if they hate him, should be able to acknowledge, like, this is really, really great stuff for the United States. And I just want to read this headline that I saw on CNN because I think this really speaks to a larger problem. The headline was Trump's first trade deal. Why is it in quotation marks? Okay. Trump's first trade deal doesn't bode well for the rest of the world. That tone of like that CNN is looking out for the rest of the world that now is going to be screwed over by the United States' good fortune. Like, this is why people love Trump. It's why they hate.
All right. This is a beautiful commentary from Batya. It's not something that you would get in the elite media. And it reflects a turning point in my life when I heard my former UCLA microeconomics professor, Russell Roberts, from whom I took 2 classes in microeconomics. He also had an influence on my life that led me to converting to Orthodox Judaism. He once spoke to me about us writing a book together as an introduction to Judaism. And then I had to go write about the pornography industry and destroy my good name. But I heard Russell Roberts interviewed in 2016 on public radio about free trade versus Trump's tariffs. And Russell Roberts said that half of the reason that he supported free trade for the United States and the easy entrance of low tariff, cheap Chinese goods into America was that it was good for the Chinese, right? The welfare of the Chinese was just as important to Russell Roberts as the welfare of his own country, which he is a citizen. And I think that kind of globalist perspective is the norm for economists and for their models, right? The economists do not tend to be national partisans. And I have a different perspective, right? I am an American nationalist. My priority is what's good for Americans, not what's good for a particular economic model. I think we need to decide what kind of society we should have, and then design economic policy and trade policy around our vision of our society rather than allowing economic models to decide the type of society that we have.
Hate the Democrats, it's why they hate the Democratic elites, it's why they hate the media, because there is this feeling like everything that is subliminally in that headline of like actually like the main.
And another good point from the chat, the markets were going to fall before the tariff announcement, and the markets were headed down in large part because the Chinese AI application DeepSeek made it look like elite American companies investing tens of billions in AI were not getting a good bang for their buck. And so that's a substantial reason why the stock market went down.
Mainstream media, it's obviously rooting for the rest of the world.
And now there are results from Microsoft and other companies that provide evidence that elite American tech companies' investments in AI are not misplaced and not squandered.
Obviously rooting for China, and it's not clear why they're not thrilled that we're getting all these wins, except that it's Donald Trump who's doing them.
Michael.
I don't disagree with what Batya's saying about CNN and rooting for his failure. I totally believe that the mainstream media is as they can. In the end, I don't know if he will have much sway or influence in enacting anything he wants to do. I think.
So I like what the chat says here. This trade war will show how much cheap Chinese junk we don't need. Yeah, maybe there will be some benefits to having less cheap Chinese junk. That doesn't strike me as a stupid analysis. Maybe these benefits will be outweighed by the price.
The corporate, I think Trump likes name brands, and a lot of those companies who RFK is going after are iconic American brands. And I think he probably won't be around longer than probably till after the midterms. But I guess I don't understand the offensiveness to like what offended you about the Democratic Party, because there's a lot of things that offend me too. Russiagate, look, it was sort of extraneous.
That was a seed. It's become much more than that for a number of reasons. But that was sort of the thing that got me sort of asking questions, I guess you could say.
About?
Just about, how has this, I think the Democratic Party has now.
So this guy was an operative for Barack Obama. He was the head of a particular county in Iowa, apparently in 2008 for Barack Obama's campaign. So he was a fervently committed Democrat who I think is now more allied with MAGA.
Become, and again, it's bigger than just this now, but I think that since the rise of Trump in 2015-16, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of neoconservatives and hawks still in the Republican Party, for sure, and I hope that they are phased out in the years to come, but I think that the Democratic Party has become the war party, at least more so than the Republican Party now.
And this point of view is not one that you find in the elite media, right? The case against forever wars and America's participation in forever wars doesn't receive much respectful coverage in the news media. All right, back to my disagreements with Nathan Cofnas. He writes that the COVID virus posed almost no serious risk to otherwise healthy young people. Not a ridiculous statement, because yes, there were approximately 2,000 Americans under age 18 who died from COVID between January 2020 and December 2024, but 95% of them had comorbidities. Now, you had 100 young people who died from COVID who didn't have any obvious comorbidities. So I don't think 2,000 young people under age 18 dying from COVID is insignificant. Also, how many millions of American children had long negative health consequences from contracting COVID? So how rigorous are these statistics? How accurate? How negative? These are valid questions. According to Grok, between 2.2 and 9.1 million American children under 18 who contracted COVID may have experienced negative long-term health effects with a mid-range estimate of 4.35 million. So these millions of people who are under 18 who seem to have negative long-term health effects from contracting COVID, this does not strike me as insignificant. Doesn't mean that the COVID lockdowns were right. Doesn't mean that closing the schools was right. But it's an argument in favor of the conventional perspective on the lockdowns. So I don't think it's true that COVID posed almost no serious risk to otherwise healthy young people. Nathan writes, on May 16th, 2021, after the COVID vaccine became available, Tony Fauci went on TV and said it would provide well over 90% protection against the disease. Right? False. It's unlikely that a vaccinated person will transmit COVID to someone else. False. Vaccinated people are a dead end to the virus. False. The director of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, said, our data from the CDC today suggests that vaccinated people do not carry the virus. That was false. Don't get sick. That was false. And the government's internal documents showed that there was no scientific basis for these claims. So we had clear evidence undercutting these claims, and so these leading public health officers lied to encourage people to get vaccinated. So the vaccine lowered the risk of serious illness, but it only had a modest effect on transmission rates. Now, people in public health are not primarily scientists usually, right? They are primarily communicators who are trying to communicate public health policies that are understandable for a wide varieties of IQ levels. And in that endeavor, they simplify, they exaggerate, they obfuscate, and sometimes they lie. Overall, most of what Tony Fauci said was probably consistent with the science at the time he said it, but we should not expect scientific rigor from public health pronouncements any more than we should expect scholarly rigor when politicians appeal for votes. These are different genres. So Grok says Anthony Fauci's statements during COVID pandemic were often grounded in the evolving scientific understanding available at that time, but he did deliberately lie at times, right? In early 2020, he lied about the need for universal masking. Right, so he was wrong. He lied at times. And Nathan Cofnas is correct to call that out. And he's correct to say it significantly decreased public trust in public health authorities, in institutions, in the news media. Nathan is correct to say that the COVID experts largely got it right. They just lied at times. Right? It was scientists, not people like Joe Rogan, who sequenced the COVID genome, who developed a way to test for the disease, who created an effective vaccine, who derived the anti-parasitic medication ivermectin from ivermectin, substance produced by a soil bacteria, and figured out that ivermectin does not cure the COVID virus. Right? Scientists told at times some noble lies and some not so noble lies. Right? Lying might be morally bad, doesn't mean that the scientists were consistently wrong. From day one, many scientists suspected that COVID came from a lab. In the end, real evidence for the lab leak was not discovered by Joe Rogan. First high-profile figure to publicly make the case for a lab leak was Nicholas Wade, who has a degree in natural sciences from Cambridge, worked as an editor at Nature and Science magazines, and was the science editor and reporter at the New York Times for decades. And Nicholas Wade got his information about COVID's origins from professional virologists. On the other hand, the people who know the most about virology are the least likely to buy into the lab leak hypothesis, and the people who most push the lab leak hypothesis tend not to be virologists. And Nathan writes very accurately, podcast bros largely got it wrong with COVID, except for when they had relevant expertise. So, COVID, with regard to COVID, Nathan Cofnas makes a lot of good points in this essay. He says Robert Malone, who claimed to have invented mRNA vaccines, when his contribution apparently is quite minor, and that many other people had far more substantial contributions. So Robert Malone makes many claims that intelligent non-experts can evaluate and see that he's often wildly inaccurate and self-aggrandizing. There's something clearly wrong with his reasoning ability. So it's rational to defer to the consensus of the experts whose minds are not obviously impaired. And you can make the same comments about the revisionist historian David Irving and Darryl Cooper. So an epistemically healthy society would ignore Robert Malone. I agree. Epistemically healthy society would ignore Candace Owens and Joe Rogan and the Weinstein brothers. There are many experts, such as experts in aeronautics, who have tangible accomplishments like airplanes that fly. So you can be confident that their expertise isn't made up. On the other hand, you have quote-unquote experts who produce zero evidence that they have special insight into anything. Most fields occupy some intermediate position, perhaps closer to one end or the other. All things being equal, the non-expert should assign a higher probability to the dominant view, because that has a stronger pull on the majority of people who know what they're talking about. On the other hand, you need to ask, what are the incentives for the majority view? Most people would do that which is advantageous to them, even if it is false. Now, in every large community, there will be crackpots who acquire prestigious credentials and then veer off into nonsense. Right? There are several thousand Americans with serious PhDs in economics. They include people from across the political spectrum. They vote all over the political spectrum. They have different views on many issues, but virtually all of them say with one voice that Trump's tariffs are moronic and they will fail to achieve their aims. The two apparent exceptions are Peter Navarro and Stephen Moran. And Stephen Moran has a single co-authored publication in a second-tier economics journal. And Stephen Moran is not a genuine economics expert. And so it is appropriate to dismiss cranks such as Peter Navarro and Stephen Moran, writes Nathan Cofnas.
Trump was the first president in decades to not have a new war.
I think you're right. I don't know if it's so much that the Democrats have changed, though. I think it's because the Republicans have. Republicans would have been...
I think it's both, actually. I think it's both.
Well,
Michael, hold on 1 second. Sorry. I want to get Batya in, and Batya, you can either comment on the conversation or if you want to ask Peter questions, I bet you probably have some. Please be my guest.
Well, I came from a very similar place. Like, my politics have always been like, anti-war, pro-worker, and, socially moderate. And that used to be the Democrats' platform for 100 years, and now it's Trump's. So the Democrats used to be like pro-gay. They wanted abortions to be safe, legal, and rare. Now they're pro-trans, which in many cases is actually anti-gay, and they want abortions to be legal into the ninth month, third trimester. And it's Trump who says, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, basically, and who has appointed the highest-ranking out-gay person in American history, Scott Bessent. The Democrats used to be anti-war. Now they are the ones pushing, or were pushing, for like new entanglements, new wars, the support of the war in Ukraine, endlessly, forever, finding new enemies anywhere they could, especially if they were people who they thought Trump liked. And it's Donald Trump who's anti-war, who has outflanked them to the left on being anti-war. And it used to be the Democrats who were pro-labor, and now it's the Democrats who are pro-China, pro-corporation. As I said, in 5 minutes, you're going to see them defending tax cuts for the rich. And it's Donald Trump who's implementing, a tight labor market, which is what controlling the border is all about, puts wages in working class people's pockets, tariffs, puts wages in working class people's pockets, and, is trying to do, anything that he has for the business community is an attempt to basically reshore manufacturing and encourage people to, he's basically, this is like, people don't get this, but what he's doing is unbelievably radical. He is instituting an industrial policy, but industry is paying for it. It is the most unbelievably radical proposition I've ever heard. Like, he is instituting an industrial policy for the United States, but rather than having the taxpayer pay for it the way it's done in every communist and socialist country, industry is paying for it. So we have $2 trillion at this point committed to reshoring manufacturing by corporations. Yeah. So to me, that's like, he basically outflanked the Democrats to the left on every issue that we care about, except the social ones where they went completely insane and abandoned their own constituencies, like Black Americans and gay Americans and women, right? I'm so where you're at, Peter, and I'm so glad. But also, by the way, this is my question for you. Mm-hmm. The Republicans can lose me if they, I cannot stress this enough, and tell me if you agree. If their nominee in 2028 is J.D. Vance, and he comes out and says, I'm a Catholic and a national abortion ban is very important to me, which is something he has said before.
So it is a terrible life strategy to publicly critique your friend's work. All right, don't do what I'm doing now with the work of Nathan Cofnas. I hope I'm being respectful. I hope I'm not being self-aggrandizing. I hope I'm not being petty. But it's a terrible strategy. Don't do it. I've lost way too many friends doing this. And the price paid is enormous. And what's going on with Trump and Israel, right? Is there a significant split between Trump and Israel? I don't know. Looking at the chat on X, Kip writes, Tesla stock is $298 a share right now. Those who saw the anti-Elon sentiment as a buying signal have made 50% since Tesla fell below their $200 a share. Make your bank off their BS. The gold I bought when AOC won office in December of 2018 has gone from $1,200 an ounce to $3,300 an ounce. So there is a significant downside to buying gold. That is, it can be declared illegal to own gold, and you are at the mercy of the whims of those with power. Kip notes that U.S. manufacturing jobs dropped from 17.2 million to under 11 million in the decade following China's entry in the WTO. The MSM thinks they can repair their reputation by rehashing Joe Biden's decline, but I believe the MSN is finished 40. No, they are not. They will still meet a need. When we had fires in Los Angeles, the best source of news on that was from the mainstream media. The various local TV channels did a fantastic job of covering the fires. Right? Every dog has its day. Right? The mainstream media will consistently offer a better product in some things than alternative media, and the parts of the alternative media will consistently outperform the mainstream media in other things. Right? Events, dear boy, events and situations will determine which entity, which individual, which group offers the more profound insight into reality. So Nathan writes, we know who is rewarded in an unregulated marketplace of ideas, at least on the right. So here's a big difference between elites and non-elites. Elites believe in a lot more censorship and a much heavier paternalistic hand in determining our access to views and information. Right? Elites want much more social media censorship than regular people. So Nathan says the people who win in the unregulated marketplace of ideas are those who appeal to the intuitions of the lowest common denominator in the most entertaining way. Yeah, but they only win one game, right? They win the ratings game and the popularity game within a certain demographic, but they do not win with the tiny number of people who determine what knowledge is. Nathan writes, winning ideas include anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, World War II revisionism, drinking unpasteurized milk. All right, my dad was a big believer in drinking unpasteurized milk. I remember there was a time when Dennis Prager and his friends were quite against corporate punishment, and I would reliably crack them up when I said, there's nothing wrong with parents spanking their kids, right? That's what happened to me, and look how I turned out. Vaccine denial, moon landing conspiracy theories, fascism, the notion that Americans would be happier working in factories, and the theory that America is being screwed by Madagascar because we spend more on their vanilla beans than they spend on food and medicine from us. Some of these are bad ideas being implemented into policy by the Trump administration. 3.5 months of what Alex Kashuta calls government by meme has destroyed trillions of dollars in American wealth, irreparably harmed our global status and influence, and set the stage for a global left-wing backlash. Right, so there are ways that these contentions are accurate, and there are ways that they are not accurate. So initially, Trump's tariffs did appear to destroy trillions of dollars in American wealth, but now the stock market is higher than it was on Liberation Day. So there is currently no empirical basis of which I'm aware to claim that Trump's tariffs have destroyed trillions of dollars in American wealth. Now, on what empirical basis can you claim that Trump has irreparably harmed our global status and influence? Right? America's power, our status, and our influence primarily rests upon us having the strongest military in the world and the strongest economy in the world. And both our military and our economy currently, right now, are as dominant as ever compared to other economies and other militaries. Where is the global left-wing backlash? So if you mean the recent elections in Canada and Australia, they both re-elected center-left parties, right? They were re-elected. Admittedly, the right-wing parties were ahead in the polls in both countries before Trump took office. So maybe Nathan is right. Trump, too, right? The second Trump administration is many things, but overall, it's not accurate to describe it as government by meme. I know that's catchy, but it's not accurate. This new administration is primarily operating on plans developed over years by smart people. This new Trump administration is substantially acting out of the plans of Project 2025, probably accounts for about half of Trump's current agenda. Right? The hundreds of executive orders that Donald Trump has signed are not memes. Trump 2 is chaos. Trump too is messy. Right? More than any politician that I can think of, Trump weaponizes uncertainty. Sometimes that works out in his interest. Sometimes that works out in America's interest. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it's not clear. Okay. Publishing in elite journals or failing to publish in elite journals does not establish much to prove expertise. Right? Plenty of what is published in elite journals is nonsense. So just think about academia's replication crisis, where many of their academic studies, particularly in the field of social psychology, did not replicate. And plenty of experts, right, focus on other things than publishing. Right? The phrase publish or perish refers to getting ahead in the field of academia. That is not co-equal with expertise. Right? Stephen Moran has an impressive track record. Harvard PhD, senior strategist at Hudson Bay Capital Management, right? Co-founded the asset management firm Amber Wave Partners. So he has had other priorities than publishing in elite economic journals. That does not show he doesn't have expertise. He was an advisor on economic policy for the Department of Treasury from 2020 to 2021. He co-authored a paper with Iranian-American economist Nouriel Roubini, accusing the Department of the Treasury reducing the share of long-term notes and bonds, lowering yields and prolonging inflation. Okay, it was in a second-tier journal. But either he's right or wrong. That's what's most important, not where he published it. I publish things on my blog that reverberate. Right? I publish things on my blog that have then forced the Los Angeles Times and other news media to react. So if what you have to say has importance, other news media will react, even the most elite media. In November 2024, Stephen Moran published a user's guide to restructuring the global trading system. He examined tools for reshaping international trade following Donald Trump's re-election. Right? And this paper might be the basis for some kind of second Trump administration policy with regard to trade. It might be the basis for some kind of Mar-a-Lago accord with regard to the value of the US dollar. So his views align with the protectionist economic philosophy of Donald Trump. He espouses the use of tariffs to reduce trade deficits and to induce currency revaluations against the dollar. And he asserts that the consensus among economists against tariffs is wrong, and he claims that most tariff models do not adequately account for trade deficits. So Stephen Moran seems impressive to me, even though he is not published in elite journals. Now, how much respect does Stephen Moran command from economists and economic elites? Not much. How much do economic elites respect Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent? Probably more than any other figure in the Trump administration. So I love, I venerate, and I've incorporated into my own thinking the following idea from Robert Lighthizer in his 2023 book, No Trade is Free, Changing Course, Taking on China and Helping America's Workers. I love this point. So he was Donald Trump's trade representative in Trump's first term. So he says, rather than envisioning the type of society desired, and then in light of that conception of the common good, fashioning a trade policy to fit that vision, right, that's what I want, economists tend to do the opposite. They start from the proposition that free trade should reign and then argue that society should adapt to this particular abstract economic model. Most smart people will acknowledge that lowering trade barriers causes economic disruption. Few suggest that the rules of trade should be calibrated to help society better manage these effects. On the right, libertarians deny that these bad effects are a problem because they benefit. They create cheap consumer goods for the masses, and these benefits outweigh the costs. And for factory workers, they can be retrained to write computer programs. Right? Retraining doesn't work out for the victims of free trade. All right, many people benefit from free trade, and many people are hurt by free trade. On the left, progressives promote trade adjustment assistance and other wealth transfer schemes as a means of smoothing globalization's rough edges. But fundamentally love Robert Lighthizer's point. Envision the type of society that you desire and then build a conception of the common good and create a trade and economic policy to fit that vision rather than assuming that abstract economic models are the starting point. So I turned to Grok, wanted to get Grok's analysis. But first of all, I need a stiff drink. Here's Mark Halperin from last week.
Little secret here. I'm going to tell you about the king's ear. Who's got it? Go back to ancient history, and anytime there's a king or a leader or ruler or a president, there's a lot of palace intrigue around the question of who has the king's ear. Who gets to influence what the top person does? And of course, that's a lot about palace intrigue. It's a lot about gossip, but it's also about policy and what happens. And Donald Trump, the court of Donald Trump, is an intriguing place. There's been a lot of the conversation about who is influential right now for this president at this time. Donald Trump is misunderstood in a lot of ways. He's a very curious guy. People, I think, sometimes caricature him as not being curious. He's extremely curious. He's extremely interested in soaking up information. And like Bill Clinton, he wants a range.
So extremely curious is a different way of saying high IQ.
Of options. And he stays up late like Bill Clinton. And he wants to talk to people on the phone or in person to get more information. The question of who gets to influence this president is paramount. It's of interest in not just Washington lobbyists, members of Congress and the media, but governments around the world want to know who influences this president. Had a crazy example this past weekend where apparently he's met in Florida with John Voight, the actor, who suggested, well, maybe there should be a tariff on foreign films. And all of a sudden now that president is exploring that as a policy, put it out on Truth Social. To influence Donald Trump most directly, regardless of who you are, you want to be proximate to him. You want to be in his presence. So you'll see people fighting to get in the Oval Office. You'll see people fighting to get on the patio at Mar-a-Lago. That is the best way to influence Donald Trump, to be in his person. Over time, people rise and fall. That happens in all courts of all kings. But Donald Trump has shown in this term a fair amount of consistency. The people around him, with few exceptions, who have influence have stayed the same. There are some changes, and we'll talk about those. As I said, being near him is important. What's also important is if you do well on television and if there's good buzz around you. Those are extremely important to Donald Trump in terms of who has influence. I talked on two-way with...
Right, we're all products of a particular society, tribe, community, and when a particular community applauds, right, that is a powerful factor in your status and your standing. Right, Donald Trump is not unique in how he chooses those who influence him. So I wanted Grok's opinion of Robert Lighthouser's point. So Grok says, Lighthouser argues that economists and policymakers often treat free trade as an ideological default, assume its benefits, and justify its disruptions in job losses and communal decline. Lighthouser sees this as backward. Trade policy should serve a predefined social vision, not dictate it. I think that's a strong point. So here are the strengths of his critique. It's society first. You prioritize your vision of the common good over dogma, right? You frame economic policy, trade policy as a tool to serve the common good. So this is pragmatic. It's a bipartisan critique, and it's realistic, right? He recognizes that lowering trade barriers causes significant economic and social upheaval. Now, there are weaknesses. It's vague, right? What exactly is the common good? It risks protectionism, and we live in a globally interdependent world. All right, so let's get to the conclusion of this Nathan Cofnas essay that I found so stimulating. I spent many, many hours critiquing it in my own head. Huge numbers of people are going to latch onto disastrously wrong ideas unless elites exercise some paternalistic control of their informational environment. I contend it has always been so, and the ability of elites to control the information environment is quite limited, and we don't really need to worry that much about people having wrong ideas about matters that are largely irrelevant to their own well-being. Nathan continues, social status on the right is determined mainly by how much attention you can generate, regardless of the quality of that attention. No, this refers to social status in certain circles. It doesn't refer to social status in that tiny circle who determines what knowledge is. People who appeal to the lowest common denominator rise to the top. Only in certain circles, they don't rise to the top in other circles. The right won't be able to attract large numbers of cognitive elites and therefore will not be successful if it does not create alternative tracks for people and ideas to gain influence. This is a very good point. Nietzsche says, far from the marketplace and far from fame happens all that is great. Cofnas says there are occasional exceptions to that principle. I agree with both men. When it comes to ideas, the marketplace rewards space is fake and gay more than it rewards more sophisticated analysis. Certain marketplaces, right, low and middle IQ marketplaces reward entertaining and unrigorous podcasts, but other marketplaces, such as the marketplace of the tiny number of people who determine what knowledge is, have contempt for Joe Rogan and Candace Owens and their like. So there's not one marketplace, right? There are many marketplaces. There are marketplaces for high IQ humor and midwit humor and lowbrow humor. There's another marketplace for hardcore pornography, another marketplace for saving your soul. There's another marketplace for entertainment. There are many marketplaces for entertainment depending on your IQ. There's a marketplace for ideas for people with IQs over 120. Right? The ideas marketplace for the high IQ crowd has no time for arguments that space is fake and gay. People who love that argument are looking for laughs. They're not looking for scholarship. There is no reason that we need to be terribly concerned about that. It's like getting upset at the movie Animal House. So that came out in 1978, starred John Belushi. It's about a troublemaking fraternity whose members challenge the authority of the dean of the fictional college. So intellectuals have always been dismayed by the wrong ideas of the masses and have frequently had contempt for the masses. Has there ever been a society where the elites exercised effective control over the information environment? I'm not sure that is possible or even desirable. Policing people's information choices generally seems silly to me, though I am all for restricting information about the production of dangerous weapons, and I recognize that society has an interest in discouraging self-harm and antisocial behavior. Social status is not determined only by popularity. Steve Saylor is as high a status a thinker as you can find in many circles, even though most Americans have never heard of him. Status is domain specific. The great basketball player has high status in the domain of basketball, but his basketball skills create no status for him in other domains. People who appeal to the lowest common denominator rise to the top of certain domains, but they have no chance for status in other domains. Right. This version of Donald Trump, right, the 2024 Trump campaign and his current government has attracted, it seems to me, more high IQ support than Trump won. In part because the right was deplatformed from the social media oligarchy between 2016 and 2021, and so they increasingly created their own social media. Elon Musk bought X, and we had the rise of Substack and Rumble and podcasts. Podcasts do not tend to be as heavily censored as the written word. So rarely has cognitive labor of any ideological stripe paid for itself. With few exceptions, the great artists and the great thinkers have always had to support themselves by either day jobs or by allying themselves to a patron. Nathan is right. The right needs to fund more intellectuals. Donald Trump has moved the Republican Party down market. The Republicans have put out a lower IQ message under Donald Trump. And with this message, they won 2 out of the last 3 presidential elections. Right? Donald Trump's low IQ message resonated with enough people to take power. Populists such as Donald Trump win elections, though I give this to Cofnas, they rarely govern effectively because effectiveness requires expertise, and the right needs to fund and develop its own expertise. Now, there are solutions, and we can look to the example of great TV, such as the Sopranos series. Right? Great TV contains scripts with appeal for many different levels of IQ. Right? People with an average IQ can enjoy The Sopranos, and people with a genius IQ can enjoy The Sopranos. Right? People with an average IQ can enjoy cartoons, and there's enough in the scripts for many cartoons that even very smart people can enjoy those cartoons. Right? The right needs to be like The Sopranos with messages for different levels of IQ. Trump, at his best, is like The Sopranos. He has attracted some formidable intellectual talent, such as J.D. Vance, Scott Bessent, Susie Wiles, effective organizer, perhaps more than intellectual, and Stephen Moran. And Donald Trump needs to listen to J.D. Vance, Scott Bessent, Susie Wiles, and Stephen Moran. Donald Trump has shown the ability to grow and to listen to expertise. His 2024 campaign was far more professional than his previous runs for public office.
With my colleague Sean Spicer about the factor of television.
What are the ways to have Trump's ear? Because Besson clearly does now. So whether you're Besson or Stephen Miller, what are the keys to getting Trump's ear?
Well, to win the surrogate war, which he's clearly done, meaning if you read that the comment that Caroline's putting out, when you know that Trump is hearing from disparate folks that X person is doing a great job, that's number one. Number two is obviously going on Fox News and other high profile type things. And I would say that those are probably the two, to have the echo chamber on your side and to have the media on your side, the key media.
So with Donald Trump, anybody can get through. It doesn't matter who you are. If Donald Trump wants to talk to you, no matter what kind of guardrails are put in place, he is going to get you on the phone. He's going to get you in person. He's going to hear what you think. That is different. That is different than most people who've been president or run for president or have had senior positions in the American government that I have covered. Here, also from the morning meeting, Dan Turntine talking about what he saw when he worked for the Clintons and for Nancy Pelosi.
In both instances, they have people who had their cell phones who could reach them, at times. There was a pretty formal process, and you had to be careful. If you went directly to the Clintons or to Nancy Pelosi with a message of I've got concerns, or you would hear from staff in some way to basically say, look, there's a chain of command that you need to work the problem up through. Things only get to the principal when they've either hey, we've thought of everything. Here's it now needs your attention. But if you if you were to step over people, you would get your hand slapped.
So with Donald.
That's how it usually works in an organization, right? You step over the chain of command and you'll usually get slapped down. All right, I asked Grok to analyze Nathan Cofnas' essay, and I spend so much time on this essay because I think it's that important, right? So strengths of this essay: has a clear thesis, it's a timely topic, right? He has a very clear central argument. Expertise is real. Expertise is valuable. The public's distrust of experts who frequently failed during COVID has led to a proliferation of ignorance with significant cultural and political consequences. This is timely. This essay taps into broader debates about misinformation, trust, and authority in the digital age. Cofnas' essay has an engaging use of examples. It has a balanced perspective, makes a compelling case for the value of expertise, and it concludes by calling for institutional reform. And according to Grok, and I agree, these are the weaknesses of the Cofnas essay. There is an overgeneralization on alt media figures without sufficiently distinguishing their varying approaches or credibility. There is a selective use of evidence. There is ambiguity in defining expertise, and there is a dismissive tone towards the public. There are underdeveloped solutions. The essay's tone is polemical yet scholarly. It blends sharp critiques with academic references. This makes it appealing to an educated audience, but potentially alienating to readers who sympathize with alt media figures. The use of phrases such as brain-rotting infotainment and government by meme is rhetorically effective, but may polarize readers who see value in the alternative media. Nathan Cofnas refers to Plato's philosopher kings and noble lies. This adds philosophical depths, but is underexplored. So we perhaps need a deeper engagement with the ethics of lying for the public good. Now, here are the Nathan Cofnas essays that I think need essay paragraphs that most need improvement. So here's one. At the height of our society's expert worship, credentialed technocrats taught a bunch of self-serving lies, imprisoned people in their apartments for 2 years, and then said that anyone who questioned them was a racist conspiracy theory almost the entire academic and media establishment covered for them. On top of that, we are told that people with PhDs in how smells are racist are also experts before whom we must genuflect. And I think there is a more expert and more effective way of making this point. So here is Grok's suggested revision. During the COVID-19 pandemic, public health experts faced unprecedented challenges in managing a rapidly evolving crisis with limited data. Good point. While many of their recommendations, such as social distancing and vaccination campaigns, were grounded in the best available evidence and saved lives, some policies, such as prolonged lockdowns or inconsistent messaging on issues like mask efficacy, sparked legitimate debate, and the tendency of certain institutions to dismiss skepticism as misinformation rather than engaging with it transparently eroded public trust in expertise. Yes, I love this. Additionally, the elevation of niche academic fields as authoritative voices on complex social issues sometimes muddled public discourse. A more humble, transparent approach to expertise one that acknowledges uncertainty and invites constructive critique would strengthen public confidence in scientific guidance. So yeah, I prefer the Grok revision. All right, here is another Cofnas paragraph that I thought could be improved. Consumers of alt media have largely given up on the notion of expertise, at least when it comes to politicized topics. When every credible economist on earth says that Trump's tariffs are going to be a disaster, they say, Nate Silver failed to predict the 2016 election, so maybe Oren Cass, a lawyer, or Batya Ungar-Sargon, a Marxist English major, and Cat Turd are just as likely to be right about tariffs as people who know how to draw supply and demand curves. So Grok says this passage is flawed by its sarcastic tone, its overgeneralization of alt media audiences, and its failure to acknowledge the nuanced reasons behind skepticism towards experts. So a more accurate and effective version of this paragraph would recognize the selective nature of the skepticism, address its root causes, and engage with the tariff debate more substantively while avoiding mockery. So here is Grok's revision. Some alt media consumers have grown skeptical of mainstream expertise, particularly on politicized issues like trade policy, where they perceive biases or inconsistencies in institutional narratives. For instance, when economists widely criticize Trump's proposed tariffs as likely to raise consumer prices and disrupt global trade, some dismiss these warnings, pointing to past failures of predictive models, like polling errors in the 2016 election. They may turn to voices like Oren Cass or Batya Ungar-Sargon, who, despite lacking formal economic training, offer compelling narratives that resonate with their worldview. This skepticism is not universal. Many of these same individuals trust experts in fields like medicine or law for personal needs. The challenge lies in bridging this selective distrust by fostering transparent, evidence-based discussions that address public concerns without condescension, while emphasizing the value of specialized knowledge, such as the economic principles behind supply and demand. So I like the Grok revision. And here's another paragraph that I think needs to be revised to be more effective. In a large community, it's inevitable there will be the occasional crackpot. And here's the revised version. In any large academic field, a few credentialed individuals may hold outlier views that diverge from the consensus. Consider the case of Trump's proposed tariffs, which aim to protect domestic industries, but are criticized by nearly all economists across political and ideological lines for likely increasing consumer prices, disrupting global trade, and failing to achieve their goals. This consensus reflects decades of research on trade policy, including studies showing the costs of protectionism. Two economists, Peter Navarro and Stephen Moran, both with Harvard PhDs, are notable exceptions in supporting the tariffs. However, their arguments have faced scrutiny. Navarro's work often lacks engagement with mainstream economic evidence, and Moran's limited publication record raises questions about his expertise in trade policy. While dissenting voices can sometimes spark valuable debate, the overwhelming evidence against broad tariffs suggests caution in prioritizing these outliers over broader consensus. Engaging with their arguments critically rather than dismissing them outright can help clarify why the consensus holds. So I like that Grok revision.
Donald Trump, things are different. He wants you to be good on TV, particularly on Fox News. He wants there to be good buzz around you. He also wants you to have the support of the MAGA movement. If there's someone who wants influence with Donald Trump who MAGA doesn't like on social media, on podcasts, it makes it hard for Donald Trump to continue to listen to them. Two people who have risen quite high in this administration already. Very influential. Vice President Vance and Stephen Miller, senior advisor to the president. I tell people all the time, if you think they're influential, figure out how influential you think they are, double it, and then be ready to add on more. There's almost no limit to what these guys are being able to do inside the government. The president talked a couple days ago about how influential Stephen Miller is in the context of being considered to be, he says, the national security advisor.
Stephen Miller is at the top of the totem pole. I mean, I think he sort of indirectly already has that job. You understand? Because he has a lot to say about a lot of things. He's a very valued person in the administration.
Another person who's grown in influence over the course of the administration since January is the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. He has played his politics with the president, with MAGA, extremely well. He's now seen as a very effective surrogate on TV, including a lot of appearances on Fox. He's seen as having credibility with people like Steve Bannon, but also with people like Janet Yellen, the former Treasury Secretary under Joe Biden. This is a guy who understands the game. He spends time in Mar-a-Lago. He spends a lot of time in the Oval Office. He's good on TV, and he has the support of MAGA. It's got all the circumstances, all the traits you need to have influence with Donald Trump to be in the king's ear. But some people are saying maybe he's doing a little bit too much. Maybe the rule for Donald Trump is going to kick in. He doesn't like people who produce bad news, but sometimes he doesn't like people who get too much attention. There's one other group that has the president's ear, and they're people who are not used to being in the ear of anyone. They're used to having their own courts, their own posses around them. Those are the millionaires and billionaires who have become a key part of the Trump coalition. Now, some of these people are there on a regular basis. Some are in the president's ear every so often. They're first amongst not equals. Elon Musk, the richest guy in the world, he definitely has the president's ear, and he's had it for a while. But there are a lot of other folks from Silicon Valley, including Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, who famously attended the inauguration, people like David Sachs, and others who are part of this government, formally or informally, who are very much in the president's ear. Donald Trump is being guided by those folks to a very large degree, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of attitude. Most of them were not Trump supporters before. They are converts. Donald Trump, like many kings, likes converts. He likes people who've come over to his side, and he respects the fact that they're very rich, and they've accomplished a lot. They have his ear. They're extremely influential, and not just on specifics, but they serve, as I understand it from talking to people around the White House.
So there are tens of thousands of people like me who believe that we deserve wider influence, but we're either unable or unwilling to exercise the discipline and to do the work that is necessary to gain the influence that we think we deserve. Kip says, I would crush Cofnas at the batting cage, even with one bad eye. I would humble Halperin 11-0 in ping pong. I would smash Saylor in basketball, tennis, and swimming. Even then, 40 would swear that these nerds are more fascinating. I cannot win. Kip says the marketplace for smart people is 1/20th the size of Joe Rogan's audience, which is worth noting if one plans to capitalize on one's thoughts. It is a fool's mission 99.9% of the time to try to make money from your cognitive labor. Sure, Pew and Grok are helpful, but what would Christopher Caldwell have to say on these matters? 40 needs a what would Christopher Caldwell say bumper sticker. Imagine how many U.S. cities would be burning if a white kid walked into the wrong tent and stabbed a black kid to death, and then the little white boy was free to walk the streets before trial. The country would be on fire. Am I wrong? Whew. Challenging. After seeing Lauren Sanchez, I think left of Jeff Bezos, his money should have insulated him. Wow, that's mean, bro. You don't see the inside, right? Jeff Bezos sees, what's going on with Lauren Sanchez's soul. So I asked Grok to compare and contrast this latest Nathan Cofnas essay with his other body of work. Right? I don't understand why Nathan is sloppy here when he's usually so thoughtful and careful. Grok says Cofnas is a philosopher and researcher who is known for his rigor, for his precision, for his provocation, and for his clarity. He usually avoids hyperbole and focuses on logical structure. Like his other work, this essay challenges established narratives. He believes in both types of work that truth is often obscured by ideological and institutional biases. This is a work of cultural commentary like his other work, and it has a provocative tone like his other work. But there are differences, right? This essay is lighter on evidence, more reliant on anecdotes and analogies than his more academic work, doesn't cite studies or provide much data to support claims about the proliferation of ignorance or podcast influence. The term brain rot is catchy, but undefined and weakens the argument. His academic papers are dense with citations, statistical analyses, and responses to critics. The tone of this latest essay is sarcastic and hyperbolic, with phrases like magic shortcut to knowledge and face planted about 5 times in a row. This contrasts with his usually measured academic style, even in polemical essays. While usually provocative, Nathan's other scholarly and public writings maintain a formal or semi-formal tone. He will often use sharp critiques, but he will typically avoid slang or mockery and will focus on reasoned arguments in his more academic work. Depth of analysis. The Podcast Bros essay is broad, covers World War II, vaccines, Ukraine, and tariffs in a single sweep without delving deeply into any. It asserts that Podcast Bros have not outperformed actual experts on COVID, but doesn't substantiate this with data or examples. Nathan Cofnas typically focuses narrowly on specific issues and provides detailed evidence. So, audience and intent. This essay is written for a Substack audience. It seems aimed at sparking discussion. The casual meme-like term brain rot, a lack of citations, suggest a focus on engagement over scholarship. His academic papers target philosophers and scientists. They aim for rigor and impact within scholarly debates. His public essays balance accessibility with intellectual depth, appealing to educated laypeople. Your perception of sloppiness in this Podcast Bros essay likely stems from the following: lack of evidence, hyperbolic tone, broad scope, platform and context, possible intent. Then I had Grok analyze Nathan's X account and compare it to his academic papers, and you will be shocked to find that there is a difference. So there is someone who's written the book on expertise, which is the best one of which I'm aware, and that is my philosopher, Stephen Turner. Love this thinker. And in 2003, published a great book called Liberal Democracy 3.0, Civil Society in an Age of Experts. And he notes that experts are usually those who other experts call experts. And he says, if we imagine a historian in the distant future faced with the task of explaining the significance of the 20th century and what remarkable and consequential transformations occurred within it, all right, two particular changes would stand out. One is the development of science and technology. The first time science and technology became closely linked. And what are the connections between the development of science and technology and political developments? So a thinker in the distant future would attempt to study the writings of influential political thinkers of 20th century liberalism and democracy to see what they had to say about the connections between science and science-related technology. What would this distant thinker find? Silence. If you turn to the key documents of American liberalism, something astonishing can be found. The greatest single work of liberal political philosophy of the late 20th century, John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, is utterly devoid of any mention of science. So experts are needed by our liberal democratic societies, but only experts understand what other experts are talking about and what is properly a matter of expert knowledge. So to allow experts to decide what belongs in the domain of expertise means that experts place topics that should be subject to public discussion in the fenced-off area of expert knowledge. Now, historically, the left has had a much more ambivalent attitude towards expertise. The right has been much more at ease with hierarchy. So the more right-wing and traditional you go in Jewish life, the less likely you are to go up to an Orthodox rabbi and share with him your opinion about this week's Torah portion. Right? The more traditional you go in Jewish life, the more hierarchical, and the less value the uninformed opinion has about Torah. So to have a meaningful discussion, you need mutual comprehension. But when it comes to expert knowledge, there is rarely such comprehension, and there is no corresponding ability to judge what is being said and who is saying it, and so no possibility of genuine discussion. So expertise challenges liberalism and democracy. Right? Expertise violates the conditions of equality presupposed by democracy and liberalism. Right? Genetic engineering is out of reach of democratic control because only a tiny number of people understand it. Scientific research on the genetic backgrounds of criminals is denounced as racist, and government agencies and academics have been intimidated into withdrawing support for it. Studies of race and intelligence have been attacked as inherently racist. Right, so we have denunciations that theories of intelligence, the test to measure it, and the social structures in which its predictions come true are all developed and controlled by well-off white males for their own benefit. So when it comes to these hot-button issues, the idea that science, with its mania for quantification, prediction, and control, well, then it's just merely a manifestation of racism and sexism. It's not neutral. So if the liberal state is supposed to be ideologically neutral, how is it to decide what is and what is not ideology as distinct from knowledge? Now, these claims about the nature of intelligence produced another collective letter signed by a large number of experts, prominent psychologists, designed to correct what they saw as the alarming disparity between what was presented by journalists and commentators on the accepted findings of psychological research on intelligence and what psychologists with expertise in fact accepted, namely that there were persistent differences in scores. So the accepted facts, simply not known to the journalists, seem to assume that the facts fit with their prejudices. So Gunnar Myrdal is a Swedish social scientist who was funded by the Carnegie Corporation to produce a classic work of social science expertise. An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem of Modern Democracy came out in 1944. The promotion of the book was subsidized by the Carnegie Corporation. Right, there were researchers paid by Carnegie to produce reports that were given to Myrdal to write his text, and this was all concealed. Right. Myrdal was chosen because he was not an American. Therefore, it could not be dismissed as non-neutral. So the aims of the funders were not neutral, but they were hidden. So to treat experts as legitimate authorities requires us to engage in an act of faith, to believe that they possess the special cognitive powers analogous to charismatic leaders speaking prophetically of religious truth. Right? Scientific experts, their expertise is hidden because it only makes sense to fellow experts and to scientists who report on the experts. So the results are accepted as the sayings of the religious prophets are, as a matter of faith in the power of these experts, not as a result of the reasoning that led to the results, which are not accessible because they are not understandable. Now, to people with expertise, such as epidemiologists, the risk of contracting HIV from ordinary heterosexual contact in the United States has always clearly been rare, negligible, as contrasted with the high risk level with regard to bareback homosexual practices and IV drug use. But out of fear of political pressure from AIDS activists and the desire of AIDS activists to prevent AIDS from being treated merely as a disease of homosexuals and IV drug users, we had the CDC endorsing all sorts of false propaganda about AIDS and the possibility of contracting AIDS from heterosexual contact. So we have a respected institution, the CDC, lying, and it lies for the highest purpose of preserving the appearance of neutrality. So experts love to move all sorts of parts of legitimate political discussion out of political discussion and keep it in the fenced-off arena of experts so that they may rule. So how much of our life do we want ruled by experts? So the further you go to the left, the more you have a desire for more and more realms of life to be ruled by experts and not by political discussion. That is not generally the attitude on the right. So much of the time when you have expert pronouncements, they are not operating within their domain of expertise. All right, they are disguising what's going on. So you have climatologists selecting variables in their models, and then they analogize them to reality, and they simplified a real world, which will inevitably behave differently than their models, just as lawyers simplify complex situations to select those features of a situation which are most advantageous to their argument. And then they claim there is some kind of casuistic extension whereby we must accept their simplifications and their models and act politically on them. It's a common device of government is to say, oh, this perplexing problem, let's take it out of the realm of the political and just turn it over to the experts.
As kind of a validator, if these folks believe in Trump politically after being Democrats, if these folks are endorsing what Trump is doing, his policies must make sense. It's part of why he's got confidence in his tariff policy, even though a lot of these folks previously were not big on these kinds of trade positions. And Elon Musk, of course, has been critical in that area. This reminds me of what happened during the Kennedy administration, right? You had a bunch of people who were known as, according to the very, very famous book by David Halberstam about the Vietnam War, the best and the brightest. People make the mistake in thinking Halberstam was saying they were the best and the brightest. The title was meant ironically, that while they were very accomplished, a lot of them were from academia, while they were thought to be very smart, they didn't do a good job. They did not whisper in the president's ear the right things history records about Vietnam. These current best and brightest, world-class accomplishers in the private sector, in tech and in other fields, maybe they're right. And maybe their influence in this administration will be more successful than what Kennedy dealt with during and Johnson dealt with during Vietnam. But there are some people who believe that as smart as these folks are, and they're mostly men, so I'll say guys, as smart as they are, that they're not giving him the right advice, that their whispers in his ear are misguided. I talked to someone yesterday who knows many of these masters of the universe quite well. He said, they really believe they know everything. You would be amazed at how little they actually know. Now, again, history is going to record what ends up happening. But these folks whispering the president's ear, policy specifics, and the validation, which Donald Trump believes in, that if these accomplished people, millionaires and billionaires, believe in him, he must be on the right track. So watch closely. We'll go forward and we'll continue to.
Okay, so sometimes what the experts tell us is not really within their domain of expertise, and sometimes they have motivations that are not co-equal with the pursuit of truth and justice. So the International Criminal Court, for example, charged Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu when they did, in significant part, to cover up sexual assault allegations against the prosecutor. Okay, the prosecutor is an observant Muslim, and he has a reputation for recklessness and impulsiveness. And he knew that he was going to be charged with sexual misbehavior. And to distract from that and to deflect that, he brought genocidal charges against the Israeli Prime Minister. So many things that big institutions do are not co-equal with truth or justice and what is right. One of the biggest surprises from my journey into Orthodox Judaism is that about half of the Orthodox Judaism conversion courts in Los Angeles, or at Batya Din, have rabbis who pressure attractive women into giving them sexual favors in exchange for conversion. And also that about half of the highly charismatic Orthodox rabbis I've met are sexual and financial predators. So there are very solid reasons to believe that Karim Khan was abusing and raping women. And he wanted to distract from these serious allegations that have great substance by bringing charges against Bibi Netanyahu. So there are very serious criticisms to make about this new Trump administration, but repeating incantations about democracy and about free trade and about the rule of law, these are not serious critiques. This is what bothered me by the one-sided elite media reaction to Trump's tariff policies, right? The role of incantations, right? So Wikipedia says an incantation is a magical formula intended to trigger a magical effect. So judicial supremacy is not the rule of law. Economist supremacy is not co-equal with what is best for society. Judges do not get to adjudicate every decision of the executive branch. Judges, economists, lawyers, live streamers, we all need to stay in our lane. Right? There is not one overarching narrative for all of life. Law is not the sole standard for executive action or for military action. So if you are losing an argument with the glib, right, just accuse your opponent of being reductive, right, reducing things just to democracy or to liberalism or to expertise or to authority or to free trade or to the rule of law. Right? The world is so complex that to have any kind of discussion or to create any kind of predictive or explanatory model, we always have to reduce variables. So to charge your opponent with being reductive is always going to be accurate. Another useful prompt for clear thinking is asking, what then? Or so what? I subscribed to Compact Magazine. I shelled out $90 for a year's subscription to Compact Magazine just so I could read a few essays by Christopher Caldwell.
Macros are completely irrelevant because any number you're getting is obviously either a month or 3 months old, depending on what we're looking at. So anyone who's just looking at the macro numbers and saying geopolitics as if that explains anything is not going to tell you what's going on when the entire fundamental superstructure of the global financial, economic, political and security architecture is crumbling and being rebuilt before our eyes. Well, what isn't happening? In terms of technology, we understand that we're on the cusp of not just an AI revolution, but an AGI one. If you've got AI, and you've got automation and robotics, and you've got 3D printing, why do you need to have everything made in China? Why can't you make everything locally, on a small batch, bespoke? And you've got no labor costs doing it, so therefore you can't arbitrage one country against another. That will completely remake global supply chains. Geopolitics is very, very clear. As I said, the US security umbrella is collapsing because it can't be everywhere at once. So that's incredibly important, because without a defense umbrella, you don't have a liberal world order. And this is something incredibly important for people that...
Michael Every, Rabobank's global strategist.
The economists understand. If you've got AI, and you've got automation and robotics, and you've got 3D printing, why do you need to have everything made in China? Why can't you make everything locally, on small batch, bespoke? And you've got no labor costs doing it, so therefore you can't arbitrage one country against another. That will completely remake global supply chains. But whoever is the first mover to get that, that first effect going, if everything is clustered here, they'll have the benefit of it. Because, it's expensive to change and people don't like changing. It's why people stick with their bank account rather than shifting from one to another, et cetera, et cetera. Psychology's proven that. Okay, so that's technology. That's itself already incredibly disruptive. Geopolitics is very, very clear. As I said, the US security umbrella is collapsing because it can't be everywhere at once. The US cannot fight a war in Europe and in Asia and in the Middle East, and is threatened in all three. It can beat any one of those countries, you would think, in a certain field, but it couldn't beat all three together. For example, it couldn't beat Iran and Russia and China. Or if it did, it would be at incredible cost. And then who would rebuild faster? People don't think about that. They talk about the fact that, okay, yeah, the US could win that war. Fine. At what cost? And then look at its industrial capacity. How quickly could it rebuild for round two? And why would there not be round two? Why would those countries say, oh, we've been defeated, now we'll stop forever? Rather than, we know we can rearm faster than you, we're going to come back, which is what happened between World War I and World War II. Why would that not happen? So that's incredibly important, because without a defense umbrella, you don't have a liberal world order. And this is something incredibly important for people that the Swiss used to understand, because of course you've still got conscription in Switzerland, and you've got mountains all around you, and you have perhaps what is the correct hedgehog approach to the world. We're a indigestible, porcupine that no one else can step in and snuffle up. But most of the rest of the world is a delectable feast, just sitting there, offering nothing but treats for anyone who wants to try and take it. So who's protecting you? Do you have an army? No. Do you have a big enough one? Probably not. Enormous implications right the way across, the economy and markets. So that's one area to look at. Another one, of course, I mentioned demographics. Demography is collapsing in most parts of the world. We are vastly below replacement rates in fertility in nearly every developed economy. And in North Asia, it's staggeringly low. Like South Korea, if you project forward the current level of births in South Korea, which is very hard to change socially once it becomes entrenched, by the end of this century, there's going to be hardly any South Koreans at all. So right now they have this boy band and girl band based hip culture. You don't have to be much of a dot projector to see that by the time, your grandchildren are looking at popular culture, there'll be a group of pensioners. South Korea will be famous, for its wheelchairs and its Zimmer frames and its empty landscapes with denuded of people. So that's happening. And of course, in the West, the balancing act for that has been mass immigration. Now, I'm not going to get into that because it's very controversial and I'm not being normative, but I think you'll be blind not to see it's highly controversial. And it comes with very, very polarizing political viewpoints, which are splitting society and having a major impact on elections. And that's where we are now. Let's go down the line 10, 15 years. Where will we be? So that's military, technology, demography, just a few that I'm throwing in. And when they all come together, which they often do, it's just transformative. And you can project forward where you think things will go, and you can be logical to an extent, but we don't know where. But again, it could be very far on here, it could be very far on here, but it's not going to be this middle of the road. And how do you invest for that?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, my question would be like, how do countries now sort of react to this? Is this the concept? Is this where the concept of this economic statecraft is coming in that you were also writing about?
You know how you invest for that? You invest in family, friends, and community, because the more connected you are to other people who are aligned with your hero system, the better you'll be able to navigating a changing world. Kip is feeling better, sleeping better these days because Roseanne Barr cleared up a misconception he had about Jews running the media. She explained it as the Muslim Brotherhood that runs most elements of U.S. media, so that is a huge relief. And our brother Kip slept great last night. So glad to hear. All praise to the truth. Free at last, bro. You are freed from your misconceptions. Okay, guys, the rule of law. Did you hear that Donald Trump poses the single greatest threat to something called the rule of law? Did you know that his second administration is abusing our legal system and abusing federal courts and violating the rule of law? When the Trump administration withholds billions of federal dollars from Harvard University, guys, that is violating the rule of law. When Donald Trump shuts down USAID and the Voice of America, you guessed it, violating the rule of law. You don't want to violate the rule of law, do you? Banning men in female sports, violating the rule of law. Refusing to extract Kilmar Abrego Garcia from the Salvador prison to which he was mistakenly deported, violates the rule of law. Now, Donald Trump's not the only one in the advanced world violating the rule of law. Please be aware that right-wing populists with power in Poland, Hungary, Germany, France, and Italy are a threat to the rule of law. Right? And the rule of law means democracy. So we must have independent, unelected intelligence agencies with the ability to do any type of surveillance they want, to then declare that this political party, it may well be the Alternative for Germany, it may well be Germany's most popular political party, but guys, it's a threat to the rule of law. Right? We've got an independent expert agency that's just trying to defend the rule of law, and so now we need independent judges to declare the most popular political party in Germany a threat to the rule of law. All right, thoughtful centrist thinkers such as David Brooks insist that we are on the road to fascism. Right, the rule of law, guys, that is the sum of all good things. The rule of law is co-equal with good sex, good food, the good life. Everything beautiful and true and just is encompassed by the term the rule of law. Are you against everything that is true, beautiful, and just? What kind of loser are you? How antisocial are you? Now, I am reading to you from this essay in Compact magazine, and this particular political scientist, he wants you to think that the rule of law is just one among many virtues that a legal system might embody. But I hope that you know better. I hope you're not going to fall for this kind of populist rhetoric. Now, this guy claims that the rule of law is not the same thing as justice or legal equality or human rights nor democracy. Guys, you understand, don't you, that when independent judges overrule the acts of legislatures, when they overrule referenda passed by the overwhelming majority of the people, right, that is the most democratic thing you can do, to overrule democratic decisions. Right? Don't buy into this populist rhetoric that the rule of law is some kind of empty slogan fit only for an editorial page. Right? The rule of law, it means the most beautiful, the most ideal, the most true and just political ideals. It's about the limitation of the executive's exercising power, right? It's a demand for the exercise of reason. It's about the achievement of predictability. It means eliminating arbitrariness in law. So thank God we had an American federal judge who ruled in February the Trump administration may not enforce its executive order against DEI programs, diversity, equity, inclusion, because the order's vagueness, it invites arbitrary, discriminatory enforcement. Otherwise, you'd never have arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement, right? The only reason that there's any arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement of law in the world is because of Donald Trump. At Harvard University, thank God for the courage of the good people at Harvard. It has sued the Trump administration for acting, you guessed it, in an arbitrary and capricious manner by freezing billions of dollars in federal funding to all parts of the university system. Thank God when the left has power, they never acted in arbitrary and capricious manners to enforce what they wanted. Guys, we need the separation of powers. We need independent judiciaries. Right? We can't violate the rule of judges. Right? The rule of law equals unlimited independent power by judges. Right? You must defend judicial supremacy if you want the rule of law. This is all very high-minded. Right? You need judges to be absolutely free and secure and with unlimited power. You want them separated from any kind of executive, legislative, or social pressure. Now, you might ask, who decides what's arbitrary, capricious, and reasonable? Who decides how much judicial independence is sufficient? Well, I've got great news. Independent judges decide these things. Right? The rule of law means the rule of judges. So we should not enforce the rule of law upon those who rule what is the rule of law, the judges. Right? The rule of law is necessarily subject to the rule of men because it's always enforced by men. So you may be concerned about judicial supremacy, may be concerned that the individuals who have judicial power are themselves the law. Right? You may be concerned that they'll invent new rights and invalidate other rights and invalidate the overwhelming democratic consensus of the people. All right, guys, we need the rule of law here. We need judges to have unlimited power to be able to check any executive or legislative or referenda. Now, you might ask, who balances the power of judges? What is the check on their power? Don't ask these things. You're a bad person. Right? Any kind of attempt to provide a balance against unlimited judicial power, that's unconstitutional, guys. That violates the rule of law. Right? Constitutional amendments to overrule court decisions, that's violating the rule of law. I hope you're not thinking this way. Here is a piercing article in the New York Times. Harvard leaders see only bad outcomes ahead as they battle Trump. Shocking! I thought Harvard leaders' desire to battle Trump was all that was glorious and true and beautiful, and we deserve to give them, our financial and emotional support. Guys, won't you please donate to Harvard University? I think they only have like $55 billion. Won't you please give to support the rule of law? Now, outside of the fantasy world, Harvard leaders only have bad outcomes ahead as they battle Donald Trump. Right? Harvard can choose to keep fighting, or Harvard can choose to seek a deal with Donald Trump. Either way, they're going to lose a lot. So Harvard's leaders realize that any choice they make will change the identity of Harvard and will diminish their status and their power and their privilege. Won't you please help protect the privilege of the crew at Harvard University? I mean, Harvard has been soaking in acclaim from the critics of the White House and how good and just that is. Thank God Harvard stood tall, stood strong, right? Harvard is leading the resistance against our fascist executive, right? It refused a roster of intrusive demands that took our fascist government to court last month. Think how brave Harvard University is. They are fighting the fascists, guys. Right? Legal experts tell us that Harvard has a very strong case. They are backed by a team of elite conservative lawyers. They're going to win back billions of research dollars that the government had wrongfully stripped away, violating the rule of law. Right? We must cheer on Harvard's unusually sharp public tone as they fight against Donald Trump's fascism. Congratulations to Harvard for refusing to relinquish its constitutional rights to Trump's fascism. But, shockingly, the rhetoric that we're hearing publicly is not co-equal with truth. Harvard's leaders recognize that this crisis may well last until President Trump is out of power, and then last beyond that if Trump's successor wins power. And even if Harvard wins in court, the university will still have enormous troubles that may force the nation's oldest, wealthiest, and most prestigious university to rethink its identity and scale and think about how uncomfortable it is to do that. Won't you please stand up, support anything you can give, guys, to protect Harvard's privilege? No matter what happens, no matter what path Harvard faces, Harvard will have significant cuts to its prestige, its status, its power, its research, its workforce, its preeminence. All right, without a sprawling research apparatus, Harvard will become more like a small teaching-focused liberal arts college, and think about how bad that would be for America. Think how that would hurt our plumbers, our auto workers, our people who work for insurance companies, how devastating they would feel if Harvard lost power, status, prestige. So, in reality, leaders of Harvard must either work with Donald Trump or secure billions and billions of dollars from private donors. Right? Harvard has never faced a test like this. The only reason it is because Donald Trump, the fascist, is violating the rule of law. Right? Harvard has cherished its independence, its swaggering pride, its record of academic excellence. Harvard thought it was immune to the power of the situation and the event. But now this fascist vulgarian, Donald Trump, has reveled in unleashing chaos that would be impossible to contain as long as he sees Harvard as a target. Right? Trump is intensifying the clash. He is threatening to choke off grant money to Harvard indefinitely. There is no political figure I can think of who is at ease with uncertainty and chaos as much as Donald Trump. Right? Donald Trump has the power to make life unpleasant for the pleasant, beautiful, true, and just people at Harvard, even while he violates the rule of law. And a court determines that he's violating the rule of law. He can still make life very unpleasant. So don't be dead right. You can insist on being right, and you can suffer very unpleasant consequences. Right? These Trump actions have set in motion changes that will not be undone. Harvard is in a very nasty position. Won't you please help? What can you do to help Harvard? I think that's what we all need to think about right now.
Through May 4th.
Come on.
They asked me in a benefit something that I've not yet Oh my God!
I've met Mr. Langone, and I'm stunned to hear he's retiring because he's one of the highest energy individuals I've ever talked to. So, congratulations to them both, and I'm sure they'll both stay active in one way or another.
I love his life stories.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called I Love Capitalism. It's the only time that he and I are acquainted is that I interviewed him probably 5-7 years ago on his book, which I really got a kick out of. And there's some vignettes in that book that you would really enjoy, including one of the big breaks that he got in life was to become Ross Perot's banker. Yeah. And when he gets a meeting with Perot in Texas, he's told, be on time, do not overstay your welcome, and don't cuss.
Yeah, I knew that one. Don't swear in front of Mr. Perot.
Right. So, and then he tells the story of what happens when he's in his company, and it's a real good story. How are you? You seem busy as hell.
I'm busy. Launched my new show on the Megyn Kelly network called Next Up. A different part of my body, and then a guest this week, Rand Paul. Just telling you who's on. They're all available to listen to again. So doing for a select group of people. It's very expensive. Get it. And
what's most on Mark Halperin's mind, then we will open the telephone lines. So Mark Halperin yesterday wrote, I'm increasingly confident I am correct in dividing the everything of Trump into two buckets, tariffs and all the rest as it pertains to the success and failure of the administration and the fate of the planet. So you're telling me tariffs are big casino and there's a lot on the line.
We've never seen anything like a president making a decision this fateful, and his supporters say it's going to change America for the better with maybe a little bit of short-term bumpiness. And the detractors who range from, the guy who owns the toy store in my neighborhood to titans of Wall Street to, people all over Europe and the world, say it's already too late, even if you shut them down now, to save us from recession or severe economic dislocation. I really don't know how this is going to end. But what I do know is it's such a fateful decision. It's either the most injurious own goal of American political history, or a brilliant and bold and long overdue step. And as they say in the journalism business, only time will tell. But the markets right now, I think to a large extent because of Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent and his ability to calm the horses, they're up today. They've been up for a while. The market's back to where it was before he did all this. It's not the only indication of the problem. And the ports in California and elsewhere are very worried about the loss of business. But it's just, to me, as big as Ukraine, Russia is, as big as Iran is, as big as the tax bill is, to me, it dwarfs everything else. Not just in terms of shaping the political health of Donald Trump, his legacy, but the fate of the planet, I think, hangs in the balance for not a natural disaster, not a pandemic, not a war, but something Donald Trump very purposely set in motion.
Yesterday, I was watching a live feed from the port of Los Angeles, and they showed a cargo ship, and the reporting was that it was 50%. I think that was the figure, empty. In other words, that which was on that ship was largely non-existent. What happens when people start going into their local retail establishment of choice? I was just making reference to Home Depot, and see empty shelves.
It's a great question. I talk to a lot of consumers. I talk to a lot of retailers and some of the big box folks, and it's not really clear. I think one of the weirdest things the president's ever said, which he said 3 times, which a version of, you can have $3 and not 30 and they might cost more. This is not a country that reacts well to being told you have limited choice. You have limited consumer choice. And the pandemic cuts both ways as far as I can tell. Again, this is not based on data, just my impression. On the one hand, people are used to, because of the pandemic, seeing empty shelves in this country. They're used to having to buy an alternative or do without. So maybe it'll just be like, okay, this is another round of that. We know how to do it. It could also be, no, we went through that. We're not going back to that. We didn't like that. I don't know which way it will cut, but I certainly think that the politics of this for the president and the pressure, particularly from Republicans on Capitol Hill, many of whom are very unhappy. I interviewed Rand Paul yesterday, and he said he can't find a single person in Kentucky who thinks this is a good idea. They're all against the tariffs, even industries where you might think they would like this as a potential change. So if the shelves are empty in Kentucky, if there's no Christmas toys or 4th of July fireworks or Thanksgiving stuff that people want, I can't imagine the politics don't change pretty fundamentally. I can't imagine the president doesn't come under more pressure. A lot of stuff's made in China. I read the other day 1 in every 3 things made in the world is made in China. But the percentage of stuff we get from China is not that high. It's a lot of stuff, but it's not 33%. So of the stuff we consume. So it's possible that if they can strike some of these bilateral deals, if they can get a coalition of the willing against China, maybe people will say, well, these empty shelves are just short term, assuming that happens.
It's amazing how even-handed and rare Mark Halperin's even-handed reaction is to Trump's tariffs.
For words, I don't totally get Trump myself, but part of why at some point I'm going to need to write a book about him is there is just a massive vacuum for current affairs and history to have him actually illuminated accurately. That's going to be surprising to many people who say we hear and see too much of Trump, but you're making a different point. For all that we see of him, you're saying what?
We do see and hear too much of him, but almost nothing I read or hear on television about him matches my experience with him. It matches it. It's not 100% off, but it's so incomplete as to be wrong. And I don't quite understand why that is, because there are plenty of people who write and talk about him who've had more access to him than I've had. I started dealing with him, about 15 years ago, but I haven't spent a lot of time with him lately. But I just know from knowing him a little and from knowing people who know him, there's a lot of things about him that are just not captured in most of what's written about him publicly. And you think about like great writers like Tom Wolfe. When he wrote a character, you felt you understood that character. You felt it was a 360, to borrow the phrase from one of his books, a man in full. You understood the person in full. I rarely read anything about Trump, and Peggy Noonan is the person I go to say she does it, but she's rare. It's rare that you read or hear anything about him that I think captures him. And every time I make that point to anyone who knows him really well, who's worked with him or is his friend, they say, you're absolutely right.
You say that he is one of the most fatalistic people ever to walk the fate of the earth. I wasn't sure how to take that his outlook is personally fatalistic, or that so much of what he's involved with is existential.
No, his outlook. And he says this on a lot of occasions, but I don't think people note it as a significant enough a way of understanding him. People say, like Kristen Welker asked him, is there going to be a recession? It's like, I don't know. There could be. And people say, oh, he's predicting a recession, or he doesn't care if there's a recession. Fatalistic. If he said, are you going to be alive tomorrow? I'm fairly confident he'll say, I don't know. Might not be. Death of his brother, death of his father, I think play a role in that. The bankruptcy of his businesses, right? He just has this extremely fatalistic attitude where people say, well, the chances of X happening are so low we shouldn't even think about it. And his attitude is, in effect, if it's not zero, You got to think about it. Could happen. It's not zero.
Mark Halperin writes, take the amount of influence and power you think J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller have and at least double it. I saw that line and I thought, what does Mark think about Marco Rubio and the perception of power and influence that he has?
Well, it's also quite high. My monologue on Next Up is about, as I said, how do you get influence with Donald Trump? Who gets to be in the king's ear? Who gets to be ascendant as opposed to static or descending? And those three guys all have the things you need, which is
loyalty,
the support of MAGA, right? When they need to have MAGA have their back, MAGA has their back. Go on Fox News a lot and share the message, and loyalty, and also fulsome praise of Donald Trump in public and in private, and be around but don't overstay your welcome. These are some of the things. Rubio is very powerful. Obviously, he wouldn't have been given the first person since Henry Kissinger to be both the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. But Rubio and Miller, they're so influential.
And what's the Miller appeal to Trump?
Well, the things I said, Miller, 10 years ago when I first met Stephen Miller, he was the anonymous aide to a relatively obscure senator named Jeff Sessions from Alabama, who was the first senator to endorse Trump. And Miller quickly moved from being an advisor to Sessions to being an advisor from Trump. And occasionally, early on in the Trump campaign, I would sometimes be in a van with Miller while we would go from one event to another. It's where I first met him and talked to him a bit. And from that moment on, again, just over the course of a decade, he's not only risen to be one of the most influential people in this government, but he has a consistent record of understanding what Trump wants from a policy, press, and personnel point of view. People may not know or remember, on the campaign trail, he would often introduce Trump. He would often give a warm-up speech for Trump, not something most policy staffers do. I found them a little manic and unorthodox, but Trump loved them because he knows where the political erogenous zones are of MAGA, and he talks about America first, not like a hired gun. He talks about it like someone who has MAGA blood coursing through his veins, and Trump loves that because there's not a lot of people who make that standard.
I thought it was interesting that Trump, when he finally extinguished the 2028 talk, although noting they're going to still sell the merch, it was Rubio and it was J.D. Vance that he referenced.
Yeah. Understanding why Trump named the two of them is impossible, and I don't even know if Trump could tell you. I know from my reporting, and just studying Trump, you wouldn't need to do much reporting. He wants to play a role not just in picking his successor, but in screwing the Democrats as much as he can by being involved in their process, by elevating people, knocking people down, trying to just make it as the odds as low as possible that whoever the Democrat is, they lose. And I think right now, Trump is another way that people don't understand Trump. He's a longtime student of both the presidency and presidential campaigns. Knows a lot about them, studies them, fascinated by them, well before he became a candidate. And I think he's right to single those two guys out in the following sense. I think that they are the first tier. They are the first tier. And if you said, well, who's the person who's most worthy of being in the first tier, if there were a third person, it's very hard to say. I don't think there is anybody.
I was playing with a Smerconish.com polling question that I've not yet done, but just for shits and giggles, asks people to handicap the GOP nomination.
All right, Steve Saylor has a thoughtful essay deconstructing the New York Times article. Headline, the Pope's neighborhood was ethnically cleansed by criminal violence. And Saylor notes the most important facts are often found at the end of New York Times articles. So, white flight. Heard of white flight? Well, that's the put down. That's the pejorative used to dismiss the lived experience of the many millions of white Americans whose neighborhood flipped from white to black in the second half of the 20th century. Just like Pope Leo XIV's hometown of Dalton, Illinois, just across the city line from Chicago. Now, the implication of this term, white flight, is that it is these false, hallucinatory stereotypes about black crime and disorder in the schools. This caused bigoted, racist whites to pointlessly flee geographically convenient urban locations for the soulless suburbs. Now, white flight is not gentrification. Right? Both white flight and gentrification are very bad things. White flight is when white people leave a neighborhood. Gentrification is when white people return to a neighborhood. Both are bad. All right? Gentrification means predatory white people are moving into black neighborhoods. All right, neighborhoods that belong to black people. These are the rightful homelands of black people. All right? And now white people are moving into their rightful territory. That is bad. It's also bad for white people to leave a territory. Anything that white people do is evil. Right? The New York Times likes that the new pope is pro-immigration. So they don't want to demean what happened to his community by calling it white flight. Now, the alternative term of ethnic cleansing would never come to mind. Remember, ethnic cleansing is the worst thing ever, unless it's done by certain groups, then it is excellent. So New York Times reporters are pretty good at their jobs. They like to include important facts in their articles, even if they might upset subscribers. But the marketing department knows that the New York Times' 11 million paying subscribers tend to value highly having their pre-existing worldviews about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys affirmed. So marketing and the newsroom have worked out a modus vivendi. They've worked out a deal. The reporters keep subversive facts out of the opening paragraphs of their articles, but then they are allowed to slip them in toward the end after most subscribers have become pleasingly bored and moved on to another article. So I consistently notice any news article that might be good for Trump supporters tends to be written in the most boring style possible, while articles that are the most devastating to Trump and his supporters tend to be written in the most exciting way possible. So have you blokes heard about Gary Stevenson? Right, Gary Stevenson, he is the people's economist.
Familiar is that he has a YouTube channel called Gary's Economics. He also has a popular trade book, which came out last year called The Trading Game with Penguin Books. Okay. And that book documents his time as a FX trader or some variety of foreign exchange trader in the city, in London. Right. He was, in the beating heart of the financial district. And he had a career. He made a whole bunch of money and then he left it. And now he's kind of talking about, wealth inequality, rich people hoarding money and the problems it causes and whatnot. So it's a little bit like a whistleblower. But
thank God somebody is finally talking about these important topics. I mean, why is there this wall of silence about these topics in elite news media and elite circles and elite academic hallways? Why? I need to know.
An important feature is that, as Gary likes to highlight, he is from a working class background, right? And he very much, his presentation is highlighting that. He makes his videos in a kitchen with like Jaffa cakes, wearing a hoodie, and speaks with a distinctive London twang, which you'll hear in the clips. I recognize this from living in London. You may not know it, Matt, but I myself am someone with a non-standard accent in the UK. So, an outsider in elitist institutions, I understand. Maybe I understand better than most, Matt, this presentation, okay?
Well, I've been listening to Gary's Economics for a while now. I listened to a few episodes long before we even had any thought of covering him in Decoding the Gurus. It was recommended to me by a colleague who likes the cut of his jib, or did. And I also noticed the accent, Chris. I know my English accents.
Okay.
And look, I think it's fair to say, as it says on the tin, Gary's Economics, he is kind of explaining economics to the layperson, explaining how it works. But it's fair to say the general theme is that it's kind of rigged against you, rigged against the little guy.
If I want to send one message, it is that.
So if you have a message that the system is rigged against you, the listener, that is an enormously popular message, right? You can't go wrong with that message, right? That's a great way to build up status and income in whatever community you're trying to appeal to.
The game is set up in a way that you are being robbed of your wealth, and there's very little you can do as an individual to stop that. But no matter how much they rob you of your wealth, they can't rob you of your dignity.
Guys, I'm fighting for you. The elites are trying to screw you. The system is trying to screw you. I'm here fighting for you. Won't you support me on Patreon and check me out on Locals? I'm not on Locals. And join my YouTube channel so that you too can understand the lessons of the Holocaust.
And it's not your fault that you live increasingly in poverty. The game is being set up such that the majority of this country increasingly will live in poverty. But
right, your problems are not your fault. It's the fault of nefarious elites and nefarious institutions that have rigged the game against you, and I'm fighting as hard as I can on your side. Won't you help support my fight for truth, justice, the American way?
You can realize that that's not favoring you as an individual. That is the result of a rotten system. It is the result of a rotten system. And I think people can deal with poverty. I know poverty is not easy, but, I grew up in poverty and it was hard. But what affected me in many ways more than poverty was the judgment. So don't judge yourself harshly and don't judge other people harshly because it's a system that's broken. And you should be proud of the work that you do, and you should be proud of what you do to support yourself and to support your family and support the people around you. Because I think once we manage to shake off this judgment and this idea that it's our fault, then we can start being proud of ourselves and each other and seeing the game for what it really is, which is a broken game that we have to fix together.
And that, the theme is that the inexorable trends of the system will lead to the rich getting richer and the rest of us struggling.
Yes, that's right. And the kind of aesthetic of it, if you look at his little profile picture on YouTube, he's got like a beanie on with like fingerless gloves. He looks like a kind of modern day vegan, right? Like, kind of man of the street, telling you like it is. And these elite fat cats, he went into the Dragon's Den and he played the game better than the ones that were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And he's going to tell you the things that they don't want you to know. That's a little bit the kind of framing of things, right? So the titles of popular videos that I see: what does Elon Musk want? How to get rich? The week Trump nearly crashed the world economy. Why aren't we all getting rich from compound interest? Why Labour and Trump will both feel the future of house prices? This kind of thing. So it's, like a political and cultural commentary, but with an economic spin to it. Now, what we looked at were a couple of sources. One was, why is inequality ignored? This is part of Understand the Economy series, part 3. And this is a theme that he touches on quite a lot. So this seemed worth covering as illustrative of the kind of output. I also clipped from an interview he did with Novara Media. Everything they tell you about the economy is wrong. Aaron Bastani meets Gary's economics, right? And lastly, his last video, signing off, how close are we to winning higher taxes on the rich, right? So he's taking a bit of a hiatus. So he made a little video to say, where are we with the channel? What's going on? So that's the sources I've mainly clipped from, and a couple of other things, right?
I don't think we're going to have much of a problem with the idea that the content we're covering isn't representative, because I've listened to a bunch of episodes, and I think it's fair to say the same messages, the same points tend to come up repeatedly. Indeed, the same references to his own abilities and backgrounds, they tend to get repeated as well. So I think we've got no trouble with the representation of the content.
Okay, that's right. And just to note, Matt, since you mentioned that, I think it's worth probably telling people, I didn't have to do this. This is not something I've got to do all the time, all right? But I listened to the entire audiobook of The Trading Game. So I inevitably have be colored for that, for good and bad, in terms of, background knowledge. But I could tell you Gary's background quite well from that book, is that he presents it as that he came from a very working class background in Ilford. And when I say working class, it includes things that he didn't have a shower, had to connect the hose pipe to make the shower work, didn't have a table to study on, had to use a plank of wood, right? There are issues of this which seem to be somewhat self-mythologizing, because, I'm not from a stunningly well-off background in Belfast, and I find few people that I knew in my network that did not have access to tables. But nevertheless, set that aside. But then he basically is very good at maths and this kind of thing, and then gets into LSE, this prestigious, economic elite university. And there he's also top of the class in certain respects, doing maths fantastically. And he wins this game, this kind of trading game organized by Citibank. He beats everybody in the game and then gets offered a job as a trader. And then the book is detailing his life as a trader and how he becomes super successful, a millionaire, and then eventually ends up leaving the bank, getting in a war with the bank about getting a payout and whatnot. And at the end, he's leaving the bank to go work for a charity, having kind of beat the system in a way. Not in general, just for himself, right? So that's the kind of tale that it weaves.
Yeah. And in his podcast material, he makes a bunch of points, but there are two ones that are recurrent that at least came up an awful lot in all of the ones that I listened to. One of them is advocating for wealth tax on the rich, so an annual 1% wealth tax on people that have, and the threshold varies, but he's mentioned £10 million and £20 million, I think, as the wealth threshold to trigger that wealth tax. So that's one thing he advocates for. The second thing he tends to focus on is house prices and housing affordability. And he's pretty consistent in blaming housing affordability on the very rich, buying up all the assets and driving up the cost of assets. So there might be other ones that you've noticed, Chris, but those are the two big ones that I recall.
Yeah. I just remembered as well, Matt, that there was one thing I wanted to say before we started, because I think this is important to flash up at the beginning, right? So if you take Gary's overall message to be wealth inequality is bad, we should try to make the ultra-rich pay more taxes, right? Give them less ways to avoid ferreting their tax off the tax havens or putting it into properties or whatever the case might be. Closing loopholes. I think there are very few people, especially of the left-wing persuasion, who will have any issue with that general premise. Right? I certainly don't. Inequality is a problem, completely agree. And the wealthy finding ways to stop them avoiding, engaging in tax evasion, great. I'm totally on board with that. So this is one thing that I want to mention. It's people often seem to make this mistake of assuming that if someone is talking about a genuine issue and they are saying this is a problem, right? It could be addiction, it could be gambling, it could be political polarization, whatever it is, that if you look critically at them or you have things to say, that means you're dismissing that the problem they're discussing is real and you're trying to attack that idea. And just to be clear, no, those two things are separate. The problem can be very real. Even the solution can be correct or viable or whatnot. But that does not mean that the person doing it that like if you're critical of them, that therefore you are, attacking that basic idea. And that's important because people like Russell Brand in the past, various other people, Brett Weinstein does it, but like all of our gurus essentially try to wrap themselves in this cloak that they are doing things for, very good motives. They're talking about important issues. And like, I think people get it with Russell Brand, for example, because he's an extreme example. But like Russell Brand, he is also talking about, wealth inequality or addiction or whatever. But if you're critical of Russell Brand, it doesn't mean that you are dismissing that there's anything to be talked about with corruption or wealth inequality or so on. Okay, I just want to flag that up.
Yeah. Well, I could put it in slightly different terms, actually. So first of all, just to sign on that kind of putting your prize or, biases on the table, I'm the same as you. I think the distribution of wealth is much too skewed at the moment. I think that the, wages have been stagnating for decades relative to other forms of income. And that is a serious problem. So I'm in favor of reducing wealth inequality across the board. I'd probably go further than Gary, actually, because he tends to focus on like the top 1%. And I think actually you can look at the distribution and the curves and you'll see that there's an awful lot of wealth inequality where the meaty part of it is actually in the top 10 or 15%, not just like, so it's easy to pick on a very small outgroup, and nobody likes billionaires. Come on, at least of all us, right? But actually it's a bit more uncomfortable when you start talking about more
the upper middle class or
Now, the other thing too is housing affordability. I also think is a major problem. Again, almost everyone agrees with this, right? These are normal things. So but that is not to say that the arguments for the diagnosis of the problem, as in what's causing it, or the arguments in favor of certain actions to remedy the problem, are necessarily good, right? Think about a student writing an essay saying that democracy is good, right? They could still write a very, very bad essay, putting a bunch of bad arguments to support that thesis. So yeah, it's just an important distinction for people to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, two separate things, but often not, it appears. And in general, the last thing I'll say is that, I'm not an economist, Matt. I don't play one on TV. I don't claim to have much knowledge of economics. I do, however, know stuff about like guru rhetoric and academia and discrimination towards people with non-standard accents and this kind of thing, elitism in academia. So that stuff I can speak to, but the specific economic stuff I'll leave more to you or other people, because you're someone with an interest in those topics, right?
Yeah, I have an amateur's interest in economics, just like I have an amateur's interest in history. And we're not talking extremely technical arguments here, as we'll see.
Let's see.
We'll see.
Let's see. Okay. Well, all right. So first, Philip, this is a refrain that you hear a lot in Gary's content, and it's about economists and what they don't talk about, okay, what they're missing.
Okay, so the first reason economists don't talk about inequality is because of the way economics is taught at universities. So for those who don't know, I studied maths and economics at the London School of Economics for 3 years for my undergrad, and then I did a 2-year master's in economics at Oxford. So I spent 5 years at elite economics departments learning economics. And I think it's important to understand the way that economics is taught at universities nowadays. So the first thing to say is, and I think this will surprise a lot of people, in economics departments, we don't talk about the housing crisis. We don't talk about why housing is unaffordable. We don't talk about falling living standards. We don't talk about why wages are falling, why it's hard to get a good job.
So there's right-wing populism and left-wing populism. This is a left-wing populist approach.
Why big cities are expensive, why things like energy and food are increasingly expensive.
All right, so it's emphasizing how the institutions and how the game is rigged against your average bloke.
These kind of big economic problems of our time are basically not discussed at university.
So he's been to the elite school.
LSE and Oxford.
Yep. And he's got very good grades there, as he's mentioned many times. And they never, ever talk about, inequality, housing affordability, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So just to say, Matt, this surprised me when I heard this claim, because although I'm not an economist, right, I did go to a university that had people studying economics, SOAS, where that was topics that were covered on economics courses. And amongst the Patreon responses, we had some people that have studied economics in different institutions, and they were quick to point out that they also had studied, these topics. And just doing a quick cursory look around economics courses, you can find these kind of topics being covered. So his claim is quite a broad one, right? It's saying that economists aren't interested, but essentially they're not interested in things like inequality, housing crisis, all these kind of, the things that actually matter to people in their lives. So that's quite a claim to make.
Well, it is a surprising claim, because the London School of Economics has a Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion, and it also has the International Inequalities Institute. So it has a couple of research institutes specifically dedicated to that topic. And again, you can do a little bit of a look around, like I did, and find that not only is there whole subdisciplines of economics that are specifically focused on inequality, both within nations and across nations and all kinds of stuff, but some of the very influential, like paradigm-shifting economists who focus on inequality are actually at the LSE. So now, that doesn't mean, of course, that an undergraduate who's doing a thing that may probably with a focus on trading, foreign exchange markets and things like that, they might not take those units. But it is a sweeping claim that he's making, and that is not true.
If you think we're reading too much into an offhand comment, he goes on. So what economists don't care about inequality, housing crisis. What kind of thing are they doing at university then?
So what do we do at university? The main thing is we do maths. So economics nowadays is a very, very heavily mathematized subject. If you don't have a very good maths A-level, you basically can't even get into university to do it. And then when you get into the university, it's just very, very, very heavily mathematical. And once you go into postgrad especially, it's extremely phenomenally mathematical. And it's not easy maths. You're doing kind of a lot of algebra, a lot of simultaneous equations. But basically, it's a math subject at this point. And it's important to say that the maths is not easy. So I had a maths and economics undergrad, and I was very good at maths as a kid. But then when I went to do my postgrad at Oxford, even though I was very good at maths, I found the maths quite difficult. And if you want to succeed, if you want to get good grades, you really, really have to spend a lot of time memorizing the maths, basically.
You have to do a lot of maths, and it's very, very tricky maths. Okay, there's a lot of maths there at the postgrad level, more advanced maths. I do know that this is often what economists like to say as well about like the level of their mathematical competence. But in any case, he is endorsing the internal claim of the economics discipline, which is, we do maths and modeling in a better way than most of the other social sciences. Not in a better way, in like a more advanced way. But obviously there's a critique in it, which is that he's pointing out that, they might be getting a bit caught up in their models, right? And he'll spell this out in more detail in the next clip.
And the context for this maths is they basically build a model, like a model economy, and everything affects everything else. So if we cut the interest rate a bit, what does that do to GDP, for example? Or if people suddenly start spending less money, trying to save more, what does that do to inflation? This kind of thing. If the government suddenly raises taxes, how does that affect the economy? And you build this kind of mathematical model. It's like a toy model, like a kind of game in a way. We raise this a little bit, that falls, this thing rises. And that's the kind of model that is basically used in modern economics. But of course, when you build a model, you can't include absolutely everything that exists in the economy. You have to make some simplifications. Some things will be included, some things will not be included. And the models which we study at universities nowadays, one of the big simplifications is that there is no inequality in the model. In fact, it's more than just that there is no inequality in the model. There is only one person in the model. So these models are what they call representative agent models. So rather than looking at 6 or 7 billion people in the world, or like 66 million people in the UK, or 300 million people in the US, they say, to make the model simpler, we are just going to look at one representative person, so the average person in the whole economy. So all you care about is averages, right? You're just looking at one average person. And of course, if we change the distribution, if I take some wealth from you and give it to Bill Gates, or if I take some wealth from Rishi Sunak and give it to you, that changes the distribution, but doesn't change the average. So basically, once you build this model, which only looks at the representative agent, which is the average, which is the aggregate, it's not only that there is no inequality in the model, there is not even any possibility for inequality in the model. These are models of averages, these are models of aggregates.
Well, once again, Chris, it's very easy to fact check this. Look, of course, there's a huge variety of models that get used in economics, just like in any discipline. You might have
There's only one type, Matt. For judging from this sounds very bad. This sounds like a big problem. If economists are only using a model that can only have a single agent in it, and they only care about averages, so they can't even look at interactions, right? This is what the hell are you talking about? This is a huge problem for the discipline.
Now, I know that there are models that don't involve agents at all, right? That just are about interest rates and macroeconomic things, right? So that could be true. There might be some simplified ones that involve homogeneity, and I think he's referring to representative agent models. This is based on this is my googling and stuff. So these can be useful for certain kinds of things, but he's ignoring the fact that there are heterogeneous agent models, there are microeconomic models, and there are all kinds of complex models that are used.
What? This is shocking. Are you telling me there's overlapping generations models that can study intergenerational transfers and wealth accumulation, or that there's human capital and skill-based models that look at skill-based technological change?
And you said you weren't confident with the economics, Chris. Look at you. You sound like you know so much.
Post-Keynesian and Colakian models, Goodwin cycles back, the people concerned about this. The ones that I knew about before I went down this rabbit hole of looking at all these different models was behavioral economics, right? That whole field, to my understanding, was challenging what economists often said was like beating up a straw man that nobody agrees with, the like Homo economicus rational agent model, right? Where people are just profit maximizing machines, because what behavioral economics tends to show is like people are irrational. They do things like they engage in costly punishment, giving themselves like a economic disadvantage to punish people that aren't behaving well and whatnot. And but the thing is, when I looked at this, it wasn't hard to find like tons of information about models which are very different than what he talks about, and which explicitly do model inequality and are like responses to the limitations. And they're not like super advanced models that nobody talks about.
No,
they're really common.
Well, even without Googling it, I straight away smelt a rat because I knew that they do modeling on the effects of particular kinds of tax adjustments, right? Because all tax is stratified, right? There's incremental tax brackets and things like that. There are things like consumption taxes, which apply to everyone equally, but actually turn out to be regressive taxes because poorer people spend more of their income on consumption, right? So the very basic stuff, like which comes up every election cycle in Australia, where they're always fiddling with the various taxes. Both parties are proposing different options. They absolutely do income-based heterogeneous modeling to take into account the differential patterns of saving and spending and all kinds of stuff across the spectrum of income and wealth. So it is just obviously the case that they do.
Yeah, and there's an entire, there's also a set of economists that are collected. I mean, there's Marxist economists and so on as well, right? But there are also a group of economists who tend to be very critical of the kind of neoliberal, market economic perspective. And they go by the title heterodox, right? It's kind of funny because, heterodox podcasters, but the heterodox economists, there's a lot of them. And it also includes figures that I'd come across a long time ago, right? Joseph Stiglitz, the guy that used to be World Bank man, right? He is in that category. So is Thomas Piketty, right? There's a huge amount of them that are critical of models that don't include various things or critical of various interventions that are favored in certain economic schools. So it's just that presentation that there aren't, there isn't debate and division in the field when economics to me is just a field like anyone. There's tons of debates.
Well, one of the things that makes our ears prick up as decoders is when a figure is making a sweeping claim about academic or institutional orthodoxy, that they're all basically the same, that they don't care at all about X, right? And they're all fixated on Y. Something we hear a lot. And I think that is what Gary is doing there. And one of my particular interests is actually modern monetary theory, which is one of those sort of heterodox, not quite mainstream alternative views about things. And it absolutely does focus on the effects of macroeconomic policy on heterogeneous groups, particularly labor. And these people exist. It is a diverse field with a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, so there's a different version of this critique, which says there's a mainstream academic orthodoxy in economics, which relies too much on representative agent modeling. And this is drummed into undergraduates more strongly than alternative models. That's a different critique, right? And that's one that you could say, all right, that's a reason. But that is not what this level of rhetoric sounds like. What this sounds like is they are brainwashing you into this model and they don't even want to address those issues, right? And again, I've got another clip that will highlight the degree to which this is being presented as the kind of complicity of the economics field in this endeavor.
Which is why when modern economists who've been to these elite universities think about the economy, they tend to think about them in terms of averages or aggregates, so that they're obsessed with the big aggregate measurements of the economy. For example, GDP is, of course, a classic one, unemployment, inflation, central bank interest rates, level of government spending, level of government taxation. These are things which you can measure on an aggregate economy, but they're nothing to do with how is one person effective versus another person. As soon as you take a model and you make it representative agent, a model of the average person, this model can't say anything about distribution, it can't say anything about this group of people is winning, this group of people is losing. We can't say anything like that in these models. So I think this is really interesting, right? Because if you want to be an influential economist in the world of policy or academia, you are going to have a PhD, right? So you're going to have 3 years undergrad, 1 year, I did 2 years master. You're going to be doing a PhD for 3, 4, 5 years. In the US, a PhD is 7 years. You're going to have to do some postdoc work, and then you're going to, if you're lucky, become a junior professor. So by the time you reach a point that you are influential in economic policy terms, you've been studying these models for 15 years, something like that. And the fact that these models don't include any distribution, don't include any inequality, that doesn't explicitly say we don't think inequality is important. But what does it do to a person who has devoted most of their life to the study of economics? That study has consisted of 10, 15 years of very difficult mathematical analysis, mathematical manipulation, of very difficult, very complicated mathematical models with no inequality in them.
So, again, just want to repeat those.
Okay, that's Decoding the Gurus, hosted by a couple of left-wing academics. They're taking down a left-wing populist economist, Gary Stevenson, who styles himself as the people economist. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.